Indigenous Missions, India's Post-Colonial Era. Written by Dr. Venkat Potana. Copyright 2024 by Drive Venkat Potana. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise without the prior written permission of the publisher, except for brief quotations used in critical reviews or scholarly works. Title: Indigenous Missions, India's Post-Colonial Era. Author: Dr. Venkat Potana. This work presents a critical evaluation of mission agencies and movements in India. The views and opinions expressed are solely those of the author, based on independent research, observation, and analysis. They are not intended to defame or misrepresent any individual or organization. Any similarities to actual persons or entities, past or present, are purely coincidental unless explicitly stated. The author and publisher have made every effort to ensure the accuracy of the content at the time of publication. This book is intended for academic, reflective, and educational purposes only. No legal liability shall be assumed for how the content is interpreted or applied. Published by Potana Publications. An independent imprint of the author. Dallas, Texas, USA. For permissions or correspondence, please contact the author at his email. Email symbol potanabooks@gmail.com. About the book. The mission landscape of India reveals a profound story of courage, conviction, and contextual transformation. From ancient apostolic witness to the present-day rise of indigenous mission movements, the Indian Church continues to grow with spiritual vitality and cultural intelligence. This book offers a rare and timely exploration into the roots, development, and expansion of India's indigenous missions in the post-colonial era. Through detailed analysis, thoughtful reflection, and a panoramic survey of historical and contemporary movements, the author captures the heartbeat of a truly Indian expression of Christian mission, one that speaks with the voice of the people and serves with a vision forged in prayer, sacrifice, and native wisdom. Dr. Venkat Potana brings to this work not only academic depth but also personal conviction and missional passion. His years of research, field engagement, and theological insight have resulted in a volume that is both scholarly and inspirational. This book shines with clarity, integrity, and a deep love for the people and the message it represents. Readers will encounter a compelling account of how India's own leaders, churches, and mission agencies are shaping the future of global Christianity from within their own soil. This is a work that honors the past, illuminates the present, and empowers the next generation of Indian mission thinkers and practitioners. Dedication. I dedicate this book in recognition of the missionary calling and dedicated service of Mr. Nirikshana Rao Gautamukala. For over 3 decades, he has faithfully ministered among interior and tribal communities, particularly the Koya and Bondo peoples across Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Odisha. His deep commitment to indigenous missions and his active leadership in the missions department of the Union of Evangelical Students of India, UESI, in Andhra Pradesh have significantly shaped missional awareness among young people. This dedication stands in honor of his enduring contribution to God's kingdom and his faithful example in frontier mission work. Epigraph. The mission flame that once came from distant shores now rises from the soil beneath our feet, kindled by the Spirit of God in native hearts and villages. It is no longer the voice of the outsider, but the cry of the insider's sons and daughters of the land, proclaiming Christ with words woven in their mother tongue and with lives shaped by suffering, service, and indigenous identity. The gospel has found its home in Indian soil, not merely as doctrine, but as incarnation lived, breathed, and passed on. True mission is not the replication of foreign structures but the awakening of native hearts. Indigenous missions are not substitutes, they are the Spirit's strategy. They are the Church becoming truly Indian, truly Christian, truly transformative. In this age of post-colonial emergence, the future of missions in India will be forged not in imported schemes but in the sacred tension between contextual relevance and gospel faithfulness. This book is a witness to that sacred work, a call to walk where our own people walk, and speak as our own people hear. Forward. I am delighted to write this foreword, as I firmly believe that mission workers and missiology educators at every level and stage of their journey will find this book both enriching and empowering. The strategies and missional praxis presented here are not only thought-provoking but also deeply practical, offering valuable guidance for ministry in today's rapidly changing world. Personally, I found this book both inspiring and affirming. It reignited my passion for ministry in India and provided fresh insights into the challenges and opportunities of the mission field. The author explores the biblical, theological, sociological, and missiological dimensions of the liberation motif, skillfully identifying the contextual factors that have contributed to the emergence and growth of indigenous Christian mission societies in India. This is, without doubt, one of the most outstanding contributions to the study of indigenous missions in India. The book is meticulously structured, combining rigorous theoretical foundations with rich field-based research. It does more than analyze history, it offers practical recommendations for shaping a new direction in Christian mission, especially in addressing the liberation of the oppressed in 21st century India. As you read, your understanding of mission will be expanded and your perspective broadened. The book opens a window into how contextual theology and indigenous agency can transform contemporary mission efforts. I wholeheartedly recommend this volume to all theological students, especially to missionaries, mission trainers, and missiologists. It is destined to become a foundational primer for anyone committed to understanding and engaging with indigenous mission movements in India. Dr. Venkat Potana is not only a rigorous academic researcher, but also a practitioner deeply burdened for the people he writes about. His grassroots involvement and methodological clarity are evident throughout this work, making it both credible and compelling. For his glory. Reverend Dr. Beom Yeon, Dean of Missiology, Union Biblical Seminary, Pune, India. Preface. The story of Christian mission in India is both ancient and unfolding. Across centuries, apostles, pioneers, reformers, and visionaries have planted seeds of faith in this diverse and spiritually vibrant land. Today, those seeds flourish in indigenous movements shaped by Indian voices, Indian challenges, and Indian hopes. This book traces the journey of that unfolding narrative, one rooted deeply in the soil of post-colonial India and shaped by the hands of her own sons and daughters. Indigenous missions embody a uniquely Indian expression of Christian witness. They reflect contextual theology, cultural fluency, linguistic diversity, and spiritual fervor arising from within the nation's own communities. From the coastal towns of Andhra Pradesh to the tribal hills of northeast India, these missions bring the gospel into the heart of Indian society with authenticity and conviction. Their emergence has shaped new missional frameworks, expanded the reach of the Church, and transformed countless lives across the subcontinent. This work presents a panoramic study of indigenous missions in India with scholarly depth and practical relevance. It surveys their geographical growth, historical development, theological foundations, and cultural dynamics. It brings to light the critical role of mission leaders, contextual factors, and revival movements that catalyzed new waves of outreach and service. Through careful research and analysis, it explores how indigenous missions engage with caste, community, language, and national identity in proclaiming Christ with clarity and compassion. The voices captured in these pages testify to a living church that sends its own, funds its own, and prays its own missionaries into unreached regions. These movements represent the spiritual resilience and vision of Indian Christianity, bold, contextual, and transformative. Their contributions affirm the conviction that the gospel flourishes best when it speaks in the accent of the local heart and serves through the hands of native disciples. This book is offered to theological students, mission thinkers, practitioners, and all who seek to understand and participate in the present and future of Christian mission in India. It is both a documentation and a declaration, a call to honor what has emerged, learn from what has grown, and envision what still lies ahead in the mission of God. Prologue. India carries within her borders a mosaic of cultures, faiths, and histories. Her spiritual legacy flows through ancient rivers, sacred texts, village rituals, and centuries of philosophical inquiry. In the midst of this rich spiritual landscape, the Christian faith has taken root through both divine providence and human labor. From the early seeds of apostolic witness to the vibrant growth of local church movements, the mission of Christ in India has always adapted to the heartbeat of the land. The post-colonial era ushered in a new chapter in this unfolding story. As global shifts redefined borders and institutions, Indian believers stepped forward with a bold vision to carry the gospel in their own languages, customs, and contexts. A wave of indigenous missions emerged, fueled by spiritual awakening, shaped by cultural wisdom, and sustained by the prayers and sacrifices of native disciples. These missions were not echoes of external voices, but original songs born in the soil of India's soul. This book explores that sacred journey. It examines how theological passion, political change, social realities, and revival movements converged to give rise to powerful indigenous mission initiatives. It presents a detailed study of mission structures, leadership models, contextual practices, and geographic outreach, shedding light on the dynamic role Indian Christians play in advancing the kingdom of God across states, tribes, and traditions. Indigenous missions in India form a movement of depth, diversity, and purpose. Their leaders, though often hidden from popular acclaim, carry forward the vision of transformation with humility and courage. Their labor builds churches, restores dignity, uplifts the marginalized, and sends workers into unreached regions with unwavering commitment. Each chapter in this volume honors their stories and reveals the theological and historical forces that shape their ministry. The path of indigenous missions is deeply intertwined with India's own identity, a path of faith, service, resilience, and renewal. This prologue marks the beginning of a journey through that path, inviting readers to engage with the vibrant narrative of Indian Christian mission, and to discover in it the unmistakable hand of God. Chapter 1. The Indigenous Mission Vision in Post-Colonial India. In the wake of India's independence, the Christian community has stood at a vital crossroads, seeking to discern how best to express and embody the gospel in a nation marked by profound spiritual depth, cultural plurality, and social fragmentation. The transition from externally directed missionary efforts to internally grounded movements has not merely been a shift in leadership, but a radical redefinition of identity, theology, and mission practice. Indigenous missions in India are not simply about national autonomy, they are about spiritual authenticity, cultivating a form of Christian witness that speaks with the voice of its own soil. This chapter explores the theological, historical, and cultural frameworks necessary for such a vision to thrive, drawing from both past awakenings and present urgencies to articulate a mission that is deeply Indian and genuinely transformational. 1.1 The theological imperative for indigenous missions. The indigenous mission enterprise in India cannot be understood merely as a historical phenomenon or a socio-political reaction to colonial withdrawal. At its deepest core, it is a theological imperative. It arises not from strategic necessity alone, but from a missional vision rooted in the nature of God, the life of the early church, and the incarnational pattern revealed in Scripture. Indigenous missions are not a pragmatic alternative to Western missions, they are a necessary unfolding of God's mission, Missiology, in the local idiom of faith, suffering, and hope. The theology of mission begins with God Himself. Mission is not the invention of the Church, it is the very nature of the triune God Father, Son, and Spirit who sends, loves, and redeems. As David Bosch rightly affirms, mission is not primarily an activity of the Church, but an attribute of God. God is a missionary God. In the Indian context, this means that God's redemptive work does not come from foreign lands but rises from within the cultural and historical realities of the Indian people. If the incarnation is God's self-emptying into a particular cultural setting, then indigenous missions are a continuation of that incarnational pattern. Christ did not come with a universal culture, but took on the specific history, language, and limitations of a Jewish carpenter in Galilee. This incarnational model shapes a theology of indigenous missions that is both Christocentric and contextual. The Church in Acts offers a striking example. When the Holy Spirit fell upon diverse tongues during Pentecost, Acts 2, it was not to create uniformity but to affirm the multiplicity of languages and cultures as valid vessels of the gospel. The Antioch Church, a multi-ethnic and contextually grounded congregation, became the base for global mission, not Jerusalem. Indigenous missions in India similarly spring from such Antioch-like communities, rooted in their own soil yet reaching far beyond it. Moreover, Paul's missionary strategy, particularly in Acts 17, demonstrates deep cultural sensitivity. He quoted local poets, reasoned in marketplaces, and adapted his message without compromising the gospel. Lamin Sunna has argued that Christianity is the most translatable of world religions. It is not wedded to a single language or culture but thrives by entering and transforming the host culture from within. The same principle animates India's indigenous mission movements. They do not replicate Western church models but seek to embody the gospel in Indian forms of worship, thought, and community. Furthermore, indigenous missions reflect the biblical pattern of self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating churches. Henry Venn and Rufus Anderson in the 19th century advocated these principles as essential to authentic ecclesial growth. But it was only through the work of leaders like Bishop V.S. Azariah that these principles found real embodiment in India. Azariah insisted that the great need of the Church in India is not more money or foreign missionaries, but Indian leadership. His voice prefigured the urgency of indigenization not as a trend but as a theological necessity. In a post-colonial era where national identity, cultural self-respect, and spiritual hunger intersect, indigenous missions stand as both a theological and prophetic response. They are theological because they arise from a doctrine of incarnation and the Spirit's indwelling of every culture. They are prophetic because they challenge colonial structures of domination and call the Indian Church to grow in its own voice. Thus, any study of indigenous missions must begin not with statistics or strategies but with theology. It is God who calls, sends, and empowers His people not to mimic foreign forms but to become Christ to their own communities. The Church becomes truly indigenous not when it is isolated from the global body of Christ, but when it finds its voice within it. 1.2 Historical missteps and the colonial hangover. The legacy of Western missions in India is one of paradox and tension and entanglement of deep gospel passion with colonial paternalism. While early missionaries introduced education, healthcare, and Bible translation, their methods often mirrored imperial ideologies. As the gospel was carried across the seas, it was frequently bound in the garb of European customs, ecclesiastical frameworks, and theological jargon foreign to the Indian ethos. This colonial overlay, though well-intentioned in parts, resulted in widespread cultural alienation, ecclesial dependence, and theological confusion. From the 16th century onward, both Catholic and Protestant missions bore the imprint of European superiority. The Portuguese missionaries, beginning with Francis Xavier in 1542, baptized thousands but made little effort to contextualize the faith. The imposition of Latin rites, Western architecture, and European dress codes fostered a Christianity that was visually and experientially foreign. Converts were often asked to renounce not just their religious beliefs but their entire cultural identity, a requirement that seeded long-term alienation. Even the Protestant missions, renowned for their zeal and scholarship, carried the same cultural baggage. William Carey, celebrated as the father of modern missions, made monumental contributions to Bible translation and education. Yet, Carey and his colleagues established churches and institutions that remained structurally dependent on foreign funding and personnel. The model, though institutionally effective, lacked indigenous sustainability and contextual relevance. It wasn't that Indian culture was engaged and transformed, it was bypassed or subdued. One glaring consequence of this pattern was the ecclesiastical paternalism that emerged. Indian Christians, even after decades of discipleship, were rarely entrusted with leadership. The missionary was not merely the evangelist but also the administrator, financier, and theological arbiter. The white missionary became, in effect, the face of Christianity. V.S. Azariah's critique at the 1910 Edinburgh Conference still resonates today. Too often you promise us thrones in heaven, but will not offer us chairs in your mission committees. This exclusion was not just administrative but spiritual. It conveyed a subtle message that Indian converts were forever immature. Furthermore, the Western mission narrative largely ignored India's rich religious and philosophical traditions. Early missionaries viewed Hinduism and Islam primarily as obstacles, rarely engaging them with intellectual empathy or theological dialogue. The emphasis was on confrontation rather than conversation. In contrast, Indian visionaries like Sadhu Sundar Singh or Narayan Tilak saw no contradiction between their cultural roots and Christian faith. Their approach signaled what the dominant missions paradigm failed to grasp, that the gospel can take root without erasing cultural memory. The colonial hangover in Indian Christianity persisted long after independence. Western denominational structures, liturgical forms, and theological curricula continued to dominate seminaries and church life. The church became structurally Indian but philosophically foreign. The result was a crisis of identity, Indian Christians torn between ancestral culture and ecclesial expectations. Indigenous missions arose, in part, as a protest against this internal colonization. They challenged not only the imperial church but also its unconscious residue within Indian Christianity. By emphasizing vernacular worship, native leadership, local funding, and contextual theology, these missions reclaimed the dignity and agency of Indian Christians. To fully appreciate indigenous missions today, we must reckon honestly with the missteps of the past. Only by naming the colonial inheritance, its gifts and its gaps, can the Indian Church move toward a future that is both faithful to Christ and rooted in its own soil. 1.3 Defining Indigenous Mission, Conceptual Foundations. The term Indigenous Mission has, over the decades, acquired both depth and ambiguity. While it is widely used in theological discourse and ecclesial strategies, the concept often lacks precise definition. This section endeavors to provide a conceptual framework that clarifies what indigenous mission means, especially in the Indian context, and distinguishes it from related but distinct ideas such as enculturation, contextualization, and self-theologizing. To begin with, indigenous refers to that which is native, organically grown, and rooted in the soil of a particular cultural or ethnic community. In mission theology, the term implies more than geographic origin. It signifies cultural embodiment, economic self-reliance, theological autonomy, and structural independence. An indigenous church or mission agency, therefore, is not merely one that exists within a non-Western nation, but one that arises from it linguistically, liturgically, organizationally, and spiritually. 3 key features characterize an indigenous mission. 1. Self-governance, whereby leadership, decision-making, and organizational vision are entirely in the hands of local believers. 2. Self-support, meaning financial sustainability through local resources without dependency on foreign aid, and 3. Self-propagation, indicating evangelism and church growth driven by local initiative. These 3 marks, popularized by mission theorists like Henry Venn and Rufus Anderson, are foundational but not exhaustive. In the Indian context, to define indigenous mission only in administrative or financial terms is inadequate. India's complex social fabric, dominated by caste stratification, linguistic plurality, and religious diversity, demands a more nuanced understanding. An indigenous mission is one that emerges from this intricate fabric and speaks meaningfully to its people not as a borrowed voice but as a native utterance. It interprets the gospel in a way that resonates with Indian symbols, idioms, and aspirations. It is necessary to differentiate this from related terms. Contextualization refers to the process by which theological concepts and ecclesial practices are adapted to the local context. While contextualization can be done by outsiders or insiders, indigenous missions assume the agency of local believers from the start. Enculturation, a term widely used in Catholic missiology, emphasizes liturgical and sacramental integration with local cultural expressions. Again, this can sometimes occur top-down. Indigenous mission, by contrast, is always bottom-up. It emerges organically from the spiritual journey of local communities. Moreover, indigenous missions are not to be conflated with national churches. A national church may be autochthonous in leadership and structure but still operate with inherited Western theological frameworks. An indigenous mission, however, seeks to produce theology that is not only biblically faithful but culturally resonant. It challenges colonial mentalities, reclaims vernacular expressions of worship, and asserts theological independence. Thus, an indigenous mission in India is not merely about Indian leadership or financial autonomy. It is about developing a gospel voice that speaks with an Indian accent, thinks in Indian categories, and walks in Indian shoes. 1.4 The need for an Indian missiological paradigm. India's religious terrain is one of profound complexity, marked by centuries of philosophical inquiry, ritual traditions, and social hierarchies. To engage this landscape meaningfully, Indian Christianity cannot continue borrowing theological frameworks shaped in Western contexts. It must cultivate a missiology that speaks from within, deeply grounded in its soil, shaped by its pain, and attuned to its spiritual rhythms. This is not merely a strategic suggestion but a theological necessity. A foreign missional paradigm, however well-intentioned, cannot fully grapple with the Indian experience of caste discrimination, communal identity, or pluralistic coexistence. Imported theological systems, be they Calvinist, Lutheran, or Wesleyan, have often failed to address the specific wounds and questions that emerge from the Indian social experience. They were developed in response to European concerns, Reformation debates, Enlightenment rationalism, and modern secularism, not the lived realities of Indian villagers, tribals, Dalits, or urban seekers. The Indian Church, therefore, must birth its own missiological voice. It must ask theological questions from within its context. What does the cross mean in a land of religious sacrifice? How does resurrection speak to people who already believe in reincarnation? What does liberation look like for a Dalit woman in an oppressive system? These are not abstract queries, they are pastoral, spiritual, and profoundly missional. A genuine Indian missiological paradigm must also recognize the critical role of narrative and aesthetics in Indian culture. Western theology often privileges systematization and propositional logic. Indian spirituality, in contrast, is shaped by story, song, symbol, and silence. Indigenous missions that craft theology through folk songs, dramas, bhajans, or even contextual liturgies are not diluting theology, they are embodying it. Moreover, a contextual Indian missiology must reckon with the pervasive influence of caste. As theological thinkers like M.E. Prabhakar and James Massey have emphasized, any theology that does not confront caste injustice is deficient. Indigenous missions are uniquely positioned to critique caste not as outsiders but as insiders transformed by the gospel. Their witness can embody what theologian Arvind P. Nirmal called a Dalit theology of liberation, rooted in both suffering and hope. Finally, this emerging paradigm must be unapologetically Christocentric while remaining dialogical. It must proclaim Christ boldly, yet engage in genuine conversation with India's spiritual traditions. Jesus must be seen not as a Western import but as the one who fulfills the deepest yearnings of the Indian soul, the hunger for truth, liberation, and communion with the divine. Such a missiology cannot be mass-produced or imported. It must rise from local churches, house fellowships, village worship, and prayer movements. It must be shaped by Indian Christian thinkers, pastors, poets, and theologians who are faithful to Scripture and to their people. Only then will the Indian Church become not just a recipient of mission but a bearer of it from its own land, in its own voice. 1.5 Identity, caste, and the voice of the margins. If indigenous missions are to remain authentic in India, they must engage deeply with the intersecting themes of identity, caste, and marginalization. In the Indian social context, these are not peripheral issues, they are foundational. Any missiology that overlooks the complexities of caste or the spiritual voice of the oppressed fails to speak to the heart of Indian society. Caste is perhaps the most deeply embedded social structure in the Indian psyche. Despite constitutional efforts toward equality, caste continues to influence access to education, economic opportunity, religious leadership, and social mobility. Indian Christianity itself has not been immune to casteism. Churches, seminaries, and mission societies have often reproduced the very hierarchies that the gospel was meant to dismantle. When missionaries from dominant castes plant churches that subtly preserve their own cultural dominance, the gospel becomes entangled with oppression. In this context, indigenous missions must be deliberately countercultural. They must affirm the dignity of the Dalit, the tribal, the economically poor, and the socially silenced. This affirmation must not be paternalistic but empowering. It must place leadership, theological voice, and decision-making squarely in the hands of those who have historically been excluded. As Arvind P. Nirmal prophetically wrote, Jesus is a Dalit in India, identifying Christ not with power but with pain. Identity in indigenous missions, therefore, is not merely about culture or language. It is about reclaiming spiritual agency for those whose identities have been systemically denied. Indigenous missions must develop practices that subvert caste privilege within the Church structurally, liturgically, and theologically. Theologians like Satyanathan Clarke have suggested that worship itself must become an act of resistance, where liturgy is infused with the cries, songs, and symbols of the marginalized. The voice of the margins must not be merely acknowledged, it must become the voice of the Church. Indigenous mission movements that originate from Dalit communities or tribal contexts are not secondary, they are central to the Indian Church's credibility. These communities understand the liberating power of the gospel not as abstract doctrine, but as lived truth. For them, Christ is not a foreign savior but a fellow sufferer who walks alongside them in fields, slums, and remote villages. Indigenous missions, when led from the margins, do not merely grow churches, they redefine the Church. They bring to the surface suppressed theologies, unspoken histories, and silenced songs. They remind the body of Christ that the kingdom of God belongs to the least, the last, and the lost. In doing so, they do not just speak truth to power, they embody a new way of being church in India. 1.6 Case Studies of Missional Awakening, Pre-Independence Echoes. Before the formal establishment of large indigenous mission agencies, the seeds of Indian Christian witness were already being sown through the lives of pioneering visionaries. These case studies serve not as mere historical anecdotes but as theological signposts, offering insight into how indigenous expressions of faith arose from within India's own spiritual and social soil. One of the earliest and most influential figures was Sadhu Sundar Singh, 1889–1929, often regarded as the quintessential indigenous Christian mystic. Singh's ministry defied colonial categories. Donning the saffron robe of an Indian ascetic, he travelled barefoot across North India, Tibet, and the Himalayan foothills, proclaiming Christ not through Western sermons but through parables, stories, and spiritual insight drawn from Indian traditions. His refusal to be ordained, his critique of Western ecclesiastical structures, and his emphasis on Christ as the fulfillment of India's spiritual hunger made him a symbol of contextual Christianity. Singh's preaching style, deeply poetic, visual, and experiential, resonated with the rural poor and spiritual seekers alike. Another towering figure was Pandita Ramabai, 1858–1922, a convert from Hinduism who became one of the most influential Christian reformers in colonial India. Her vision for female empowerment, her critiques of caste and patriarchy, and her founding of the Muddy Mission reflect a holistic and liberative vision of mission. Ramabai refused to separate spiritual transformation from social uplift. At the Muddy Mission, she offered refuge to widows, orphans, and marginalized girls, many of whom became vibrant witnesses to Christ in their communities. Her use of Marathi scripture and hymns enabled women to access Christian truths in their mother tongue, facilitating an indigenous form of discipleship that was both liberating and context-sensitive. Narayan Vaman Tilak, 1862–1919, a Brahmin convert to Christianity, developed a liturgical and poetic theology that incorporated Indian music, bhajans, and folk religious forms. Tilak composed Christian hymns in Marathi meter, utilized Indian musical instruments in worship, and emphasized the indigenization of theological education. His ministry reflected a deep conviction that Christianity in India must be both spiritually authentic and culturally familiar. These early leaders anticipated key dimensions of modern indigenous mission theology: local language, vernacular worship, anti-caste ethos, gender justice, and cultural incarnation. They bore witness not only to Christ but to the possibility of a Christianity that was fully Indian and fully Christian. Their ministries were not movements in the institutional sense but awakenings in the spiritual landscape of India. They offered a prophetic alternative to colonial missions not by rejecting the gospel, but by embodying it in Indian forms. The seeds they planted have continued to grow into the varied and vibrant landscape of indigenous missions across India today. 1.7 Post-independence shifts. From inherited structures to indigenous movements. The dawn of Indian independence in 1947 marked a seismic shift not only in politics and governance but also in the religious and missional landscape of the nation. The departure of many Western missionaries, either voluntarily or under political pressure, created a vacuum in ecclesial leadership and missionary activity. What initially appeared as a crisis soon revealed itself as a kairos moment for the Indian Church, a divine opportunity to reimagine its vocation, leadership, and strategy. In the decades following independence, Indian Christians began to take increasing ownership of the Church and its mission. Indigenous leaders stepped into roles that had long been reserved for foreign personnel. Church denominations, seminaries, and mission societies slowly transitioned to Indian governance. Yet, while administrative control passed to Indian hands, the deeper challenge remained: how to decolonize the imagination of the Church. This post-independence period saw the emergence of distinctly indigenous mission movements, not merely Indian-led but Indian-shaped. One significant development was the rise of grassroots evangelism spearheaded by local believers who did not carry Western theological credentials but were deeply rooted in their communities. Their methods were relational, narrative, and often sacrificial. Small fellowships, house churches, and community-based ministries became the new wineskins for gospel proclamation. Another major shift was the growing emphasis on cross-cultural mission from within India. Indigenous mission agencies such as the Indian Evangelical Mission, IEM, Friends Missionary Prayer Band, FMPB, and Gospel Echoing Missionary Society, GEMS, began sending missionaries from South India to the north, from urban centers to tribal belts. These movements represented a theological awakening, that India could not only receive missionaries but send them. And more importantly, that this sending would arise not from colonial wealth but from prayer, faith, and indigenous vision. Simultaneously, there was a noticeable decline in dependence on foreign funding. Indigenous missions began to rely on the tent-maker model, where missionaries supported themselves through secular employment while planting churches and discipling believers. This model, rooted in Pauline practice, proved both strategic and sustainable in a country with increasing restrictions on religious activities. The post-independence era also witnessed significant theological innovation. Seminaries and Bible colleges began incorporating Indian philosophy, literature, and social critique into their curricula. Theologians from Dalit, tribal, and women's perspectives started shaping discourse previously dominated by Western paradigms. Liturgies were crafted in local languages. Songs and prayers took on indigenous melodies and meters. The Church began to sound more Indian in its worship and more prophetic in its witness. Though challenges remained, particularly caste dynamics, financial limitations, and political resistance, the movement toward indigenous expression gained irreversible momentum. The Indian Church was no longer an echo, it had found its voice. And this voice, shaped by suffering, resilience, and spiritual depth, became a testimony not only to India but to the global body of Christ. 1.8 The current missional landscape. Strengths, gaps, and hope. As India moves deeper into the 21st century, the indigenous mission landscape continues to evolve with both remarkable progress and pressing challenges. The gains of the post-independence era have led to a stronger, more confident Indian Church. Indigenous mission agencies, church networks, and theological institutions now dot the subcontinent. These entities are not merely surviving, they are multiplying. Yet alongside these strengths, gaps remain, requiring renewed vision, prayer, and discernment. Strengths. One of the most encouraging signs is the sheer number of mission-sending agencies operating entirely under Indian leadership. Many of these organizations have developed internal governance systems, mission training schools, and regional mobilization strategies that reflect contextual wisdom. They demonstrate financial creativity, community-based fundraising, and sacrificial giving even among economically modest churches. Language contextualization and regional focus have also matured. Indigenous missionaries now serve in their own or neighboring linguistic groups, reducing the cultural and communicative gaps that once hindered effective witness. This cultural nearness enhances the reception of the gospel and allows for deeper pastoral presence. Moreover, theological awareness is growing. Contextual theology rooted in caste critique, Dalit identity, tribal cosmology, and gendered experiences is no longer confined to the academy but is increasingly informing mission practice. Worship styles, preaching methods, and even organizational structures are gradually reflecting this shift. Gaps. Yet for all the vibrancy, indigenous missions still struggle with several systemic challenges. One of the most critical is the lingering dependency on foreign theological frameworks. While administrative leadership has been indigenized, curricula in many seminaries continue to reflect Western epistemologies. Without robust theological formation in Indian categories, missions risk reproducing foreign patterns under Indian names. Another concern is the disparity between urban and rural missions. While metro-based churches enjoy growing resources and platforms, mission work in rural and tribal areas continues to lack adequate support and representation. The uneven distribution of resources not only hampers expansion but also creates internal hierarchies within the indigenous movement itself. There is also a growing need for second-generation leadership. As pioneer leaders retire, the question arises whether the vision, sacrificial spirit, and contextual insight will be passed on or diluted by institutionalism. Leadership development must therefore become central to any sustainable mission strategy. Hope. Despite these challenges, there is deep reason for hope. Young Christians, many from non-Christian backgrounds, are taking up the mantle of leadership, church planting, and community transformation. Indigenous worship expressions are flourishing in local churches. Digital platforms are being used to spread the gospel in native languages. Prayer movements are stirring across regions, and mission partnerships are forming across castes and ethnicities. The Indian Church today stands at a crossroad. It can either seek legitimacy by mimicking Western models or embrace the risky, beautiful path of being truly indigenous, shaped by local stories, inspired by Christ, and empowered by the Holy Spirit. The journey is complex, but the foundations are already laid. The voice of indigenous missions is no longer a whisper. It is becoming a song, prophetic, polyphonic, and profoundly Indian. 1.9 Toward a Theology of Hope and Suffering in Indian Missions. In the context of Indian indigenous missions, any robust theology must reckon with suffering not as an abstract category, but as a lived and communal experience. The history of Christianity in India is replete with testimonies of resilience amid persecution, poverty, rejection, and systemic injustice. Whether in tribal belts, urban slums, or among oppressed castes, Indian Christians have learned to follow Christ not from positions of privilege, but from the underside of history. A theology of hope and suffering, therefore, is not an optional appendage but a necessary lens. Indigenous missions carry within them not only the proclamation of good news but the embodiment of Christ's suffering presence. This is not merely to echo Pauline themes of suffering in mission, 2 Corinthians 4:7-12, but to affirm that suffering is a fertile ground where the gospel often takes root most deeply. Hope in this context is not mere optimism or escape. It is eschatological. It speaks of a future secured in Christ that gives courage in the present. The indigenous missionary who walks miles to share the gospel, facing ridicule or arrest, is not driven by success metrics but by a deep hope that God's kingdom is already breaking in even in marginal places. This hope is sustained by a theology that draws from Indian spiritual metaphors, the journey, the yatra, the suffering servant, the sacrificial offering, the triumph of light over darkness. These symbols are not borrowed for illustration but integrated for revelation. In the Indian context, theological imagination rooted in suffering becomes prophetic resistance. Moreover, suffering opens doors for authentic solidarity. The indigenous missionary does not merely serve the poor but lives among them. This incarnational posture mirroring Christ who dwelt among us gives indigenous missions a credibility and moral authority that institutional frameworks often lack. A theology of hope and suffering, then, invites the Church to affirm weakness as a site of strength, and vulnerability as a vessel of God's power. It is not triumphalist, but truthful. It does not promise escape from suffering, but endurance through it. And most importantly, it proclaims that in the ashes of India's marginalized communities, God is raising voices of praise, defiance, and mission. 1.10 The Road Ahead. Reimagining Mission in a New India. As India stands on the threshold of socio-political and cultural transformation, the future of indigenous missions calls for bold imagination, rooted wisdom, and spirit-led innovation. The challenges are immense: rising religious nationalism, digital saturation, urban migration, and ecological crisis. Yet these very complexities offer fresh opportunities for mission that is deeply Indian, vibrantly Christian, and prophetically engaged. To reimagine mission in a new India, the indigenous church must first embrace a missional identity that transcends denominational boundaries. The fragmentation of the Indian church into competing traditions weakens the witness of Christ. Mission in the 21st century must move toward collaborative synergy, sharing resources, honoring diverse expressions, and working together in unity. Kingdom witness must outweigh institutional brand. Second, indigenous missions must integrate faith and public life. This includes active engagement in education, healthcare, advocacy for justice, and environmental stewardship. In a country where millions still suffer systemic neglect, the Church cannot remain confined to spiritual rhetoric. The mission must be holistic, meeting both soul and society. As early Indian Christians like Pandita Ramabai demonstrated, gospel proclamation is incomplete without gospel embodiment. Third, digital culture must be engaged, not escaped. India's youth are digital natives. The mission field now includes social media, podcasts, video platforms, and mobile apps. Indigenous missions must innovate here, not with entertainment-driven content, but with truthful storytelling, theological clarity, and pastoral presence in virtual spaces. Fourth, theological formation must continue to decolonize. Seminaries and training institutes must prioritize local epistemologies, oral traditions, vernacular theology, and the voices of the marginalized. Faculty must include practitioners, not just academics. Curricula must reflect lived realities, not just imported categories. Lastly, the road ahead requires a renewed spirituality. Programs, strategies, and structures are not enough. India needs a praying church, a spirit-filled, weeping, worshipping, risk-taking people who love Christ more than comfort and love their neighbor more than control. Without such depth, the mission will be organizationally busy but spiritually barren. The reimagined mission of India will not come from grand conferences or foreign strategies. It will rise from small prayer groups, faithful pastors, bivocational missionaries, and communities rooted in justice and joy. It will come not by might, nor by power, but by the Spirit of the living God. Zechariah 4:6. The road ahead is uncertain, but it is also sacred. Indigenous missions have come a long way from the margins of colonial ecclesiology to the center of national witness. Now, with courage, creativity, and consecration, they must take the next step. Reimagining Christian Witness. Chapter 1 lays a compelling theological and historical foundation for understanding indigenous missions in post-colonial India. It begins by grounding mission in the very nature of God, Missiology, and highlights how indigenous expressions of Christianity reflect the incarnational and Pentecostal patterns seen in Scripture. The chapter critically examines the colonial legacy of Western missions, exposing how foreign cultural impositions often undermined the Gospel's reception and stifled indigenous leadership. The conceptual clarity around indigenous mission is established not merely as Indian-led efforts, but as culturally rooted, theologically contextual, and structurally autonomous movements. The need for a distinct Indian missiological paradigm is emphasized, especially in light of caste injustice, cultural plurality, and the inadequacy of imported theological frameworks. Voices from the margins, Dalits, tribals, women are given center stage, affirming their indispensable role in the Church's witness. Historical case studies: Sadhu Sundar Singh, Pandita Ramabai, Narayan Tilak, demonstrate that contextualized Christian expression existed even before independence, offering spiritual and practical blueprints for today. The post-1947 era is marked as a turning point, when indigenous agencies and leaders began shaping the mission field with authenticity and resilience. Today, the landscape is rich with growth and contextual engagement, though it still wrestles with theological dependency, urban-rural disparity, and leadership transition. The chapter concludes by calling for a theology of suffering and hope that resonates with India's wounded but resilient spirit. Looking forward, it urges indigenous missions to embrace unity, public engagement, digital innovation, theological decolonization, and deep spirituality, charting a path that is uniquely Indian, deeply Christian, and prophetically relevant. Chapter 2. The story of indigenous missions in India is not only a theological response to colonial Christianity but also a complex narrative shaped by history, resistance, adaptation, and renewal. While Chapter 1 laid the conceptual and theological groundwork for understanding indigenous missions in principle, this chapter turns to the actual development and shaping of indigenous movements across the Indian subcontinent. It explores the real people, real communities, and real struggles that have informed the practice of indigenous mission since the early 20th century. From small prayer fellowships in rural villages to dynamic evangelistic networks in urban centers, this chapter brings into view the lived reality of a mission that has emerged from within rather than been imposed from without. This chapter also examines the evolution of indigenous mission agencies, regional patterns of growth, and the theological innovations they have fostered. Rather than offering a mere chronology, it aims to trace the spirit behind these movements, the spiritual hunger that birthed them, the socio-political pressures that shaped them, and the ecclesial visions that sustained them. These stories help us understand how India's indigenous missions are not simply a response to Western absence but a declaration of contextual faithfulness and prophetic relevance. They serve not only as historical documentation but as living testimonies of the Indian Church's maturing voice and missional calling. 2 Indigenous missions in India. Emergence, Growth, and Assessment. This book highlights the indigenous Christian mission's witness of the gospel from an Indian perspective, and it is a comprehensive study on the subject of indigenous missionary movements in India, IMMI. It addresses mainly the important areas such as definitions of the key terms, geographical emergence and expansion, contextual factors, theological factors, leadership factors, and significant mission conferences related to the IMMI. It also addresses the nature and function of IMMI and important issues related to missionaries. Another focus of the chapter is to survey and review the literature related to the indigenous mission societies in post-independent India. Since there are hundreds of indigenous missions societies, indigenous churches, and para-church organizations in India that have contributed in a significant way to the service of the people of India, it is not possible to include all the mission agencies in this chapter. The limitation of the study is that indigenous missionary movements are selected mostly from South India. At the same time, Northeast India's indigenous missions movement's significant contribution has been acknowledged because most of them are denominational mission agencies, unlike South India, and they are sending thousands of missionaries to most parts of India and several foreign countries. Another criterion for the selections is that the mission agencies that are affiliated with the Indian Mission Association, IMA, that made a significant impact on cross-cultural missions. Therefore, the study has been limited to IMS, NMS, FMPB, IEM, UESI, ICPF, CSI, CNI, ICP, LEF, BYM, IMA, BMM, and BCM. 2.1 Geographical emergence and expansion of indigenous missions and their witness. There was a slow progress of Christian witness in India until the people movements that happened among the Dalits in the second half of the 19th century. Prior to these people's movements, there were missionary efforts to reach the forward caste groups in India. Some scholars say that Christianity in India emerged as an indigenous mission. As per Moffat's secondary sources on St. Thomas's, a disciple of Christ, the early church, thousands were converted. 6,850 of the Brahmin caste, 2,590 Kshatriyas, and 3,780 Vaishyas, not to mention 2 kings and 7 village chiefs whom he ordained as bishops and leaders of the church. This early church's mission fervor did not continue for a long time. The forward caste Christians held high positions in the church, and in fact, they did not want to lower their status by converting people from the lower classes. Caste was the major issue in Christian missions from the beginning of its inception in India. Most of the available literature does not talk about the Indian Church's interaction with people of other faiths. Still, almost all the authors addressed the issue of Indian Church's interaction and struggle with the Western Church. The mission history is written in the context of the Church's relationship with the West instead of its relationship with the people of India, which is one of the huge gaps in the literature. Robert de Nobili, 1577–1656, who came to India in 1602, attempted to witness the gospel to Indians from the top, i.e., through the Brahmin elite. He did succeed in witnessing caste Hindus, but there was no numerical growth in his mission work. He visualized that the Christian mission gradually expanded from higher caste groups to the lower castes, which did not happen in his mission practice. Instead, his mission approach created confusion in mission praxis because of his identification with the forward caste groups in India. The Protestant missionaries made some efforts to reach forward caste Hindus, and they, too, tried top-down but did not succeed because of their Western approach. Alexander Duff, 1806–1878, a missionary from the Church of Scotland who came to India in 1830, discovered the fact that Christianity in India had not been able to influence the forward caste Hindus. Duff believed that witnessing the gospel to Hindus in India would be possible only through the forward caste Brahmin community. He also believed that Western English education would help them to read the scripture and understand the fallacies of Hinduism, which eventually would lead them to understand the Christian faith. In order to achieve his mission of witnessing forward caste Hindus, Duff initiated an education mission method, but he did not succeed. William Carey also tried to reach higher sections of the people, and his method of evangelism was quite significant. He used to join with the Brahmins, who sat in groups at temples, and he raised the religious discussions through which he introduced the Bible as Christian Shasta. The Serampuri trio established mission stations among Hindustani and Muslim provinces of North India between 1816 and 1817, and they extended their mission from Bengal to Burma and the East Indies and then to Bihar and India's west. Serampuri mission made some efforts to reach forward caste Hindus in India. Still, their methods were Western, and they did not develop indigenous theology so that they could relate to the people of other faiths in India. Therefore, it is evidence that the early Western missions originally concentrated and made some efforts to reach higher caste groups in India because it was believed that Christianity would percolate downward from the upper castes to the lower castes. In fact, the Western missions' belief might be correct. Still, their practice had a problem because they imposed their Western paradigm against the attitude of the people of other faiths in India. They tried to reach the forward caste people of India with their Western theology and methodology that did not work out. Therefore, even though Protestant Western missions made efforts to witness to the people of India, their methods and approach were Western, and they could not relate relevantly and effectively with the people of India. There was no good progress and expansion of the Christian faith before the mid-19th century. The Hindu society was resistant to the gospel mainly because of the cultural, religious, and social stigmas. The Western missions could not succeed in influencing the forward caste people in India. As a result, missionaries shifted their concentration from mission from above to mission from below. There was a tremendous response from the untouchables during the mid-19th century, which resulted in people's movements. Richter informs the fact that mass conversations among the Dalits in the Madras Presidency increased the number of Christians from 74,000 to 300,000 during the period from 1851 to 1871. The missionaries did not expect these massive group and people movements, and in fact, they did not initiate anything for such massive results. These results were from the people themselves as an identity because the Christian faith offered dignity, social mobility, and identity. The Dalits, who were longing for social, political, economic, and religious liberation, came forward to embrace the Christian faith. These people's movements occurred in some of the places that were not the focus areas of the missionaries. The significance of these people's movements is that they are the result of Dalet's search for social dignity and religious identity. Since the 19th century opened the way for the unexpected bloom of people movements from the depressed classes, the Western missionaries shifted their focus from reaching forward caste people to the depressed classes, and they totally neglected to witness forward caste Hindus. The Western missions during the late 19th and 20th centuries expanded their mission work mostly among the depressed classes, especially the Catholic missions concentrated much on these underprivileged sections of the people of India. The Western missions monopolized Indian missions before and after the independent eras and expanded their Western form of Christianity in India through their denominational territorial kingdoms. Their theology, liturgy, and mission methods were imposed on Indian missions, which were not relevant to the people of India, especially to the forward caste Hindus. In this context, a few indigenous mission movements emerged with a vision to witness Indians with indigenous mission principles before the independent era. Still, they, too, inherited the Western mission practice that is relevant to the depressed classes. The prominent indigenous mission movements were the Marthoma Evangelistic Association, 1888, Mutha Missions, 1889, IMS, 1903, and NMS, 1905, which made some impact on the geographical expansion of Christian missions in India. These movements are still vibrant and active in witnessing to Indians, but their mission strategies are relevant to the depressed classes and underprivileged sections of the people. The post-independence era made it necessary for the emergence and growth of indigenous missions in India because the Western missionaries had to leave the country due to the strict Indian government policies regarding religious conversions. A bill, the Indian Converts, Regulation and Registration, Bill, had come to the Indian Parliament in 1955 to restrict the conversions. The foreign missionaries were not given visas easily. As a result, the established Western missions transferred their leadership to the indigenous leadership and administration. Consequently, indigenous missions emerged in various parts of the country. Still, they continued the Western mission methods and mission approach that did not make a big difference in witnessing to the people of other faiths in India. The geographical emergence of indigenous missions in South, North, and Northeast India has been discussed in the following section. 2.1.1 South India. South India played a vital role in the emergence of indigenous missions in India. Segal's informs the fact that it was during the post-independence decades, particularly in the 60s and 70s, South India saw a proliferation of indigenous, evangelical, interdenominational missionary movements. Significant cross-cultural missionary movements have emerged in South India, which expanded to North Indian states. Theodore Williams, in his article on Indian missions and indigenous missions of India edited by Hedlund and Rankuma, gives some of the denominational and interdenominational missions' contributions to the geographical expansion of the Christian mission work. One of the major reasons for the emergence of indigenous missions from South India is the spiritual revival that took place in the Church of South India. Barnabas affirms that mission initiatives and mission movements came into existence out of the spiritual revival that took place in the Church in South India. He illustrates his argument from the revival that took place in CSI during the mid-20th century that gave birth to indigenous missions such as FMPB and IEM. Barnabas also informs that the Vacation Bible School Movement, VBS, Youth for Christ, YFC, and Ambassadors for Christ, which are Western missions, brought great revival in CSI churches in Tamil Nadu. Union of Evangelical Students of India and Blessing Youth Missions, which made a tremendous impact on college and university students, came into existence out of revival movements in the South Indian Church. There is an element of truth in Barnabas' argument in saying that spiritual revival triggered indigenous missions in South India. Still, the other factors can be the caste system, language, and regional spirit behind the emergence and expansion of indigenous missions. The Syrian forward caste community dominated most of the indigenous missions that emerged in the state of Kerala in the initial stage. Indigenous missions in the state of Kerala emerged and expanded because of this caste bond relationship that united a particular group of people. As per my knowledge, there is little research done in this aspect, but the commitment and glory of the mission leaders have been highlighted in several writings. The Pentecostal movement that triggered indigenous Pentecostal churches in Kerala and several other southern and northern Indian states has Syrian dominance. Sharon Fellowship, P. J. Thomas, 1953, New India Bible Church, Thomas Phillip, Abraham Phillip, 1972, New India Church of God, V. A. Tambi, 1973, and Gospel for Asia, K. P. Yohanan, 1978, are the major Pentecostal movements that emerged and made a significant contribution to the expansion of the Church in India. Gospel for Asia, GFA, was initiated as mission work in its inception stage, but later, it adopted a church structure. These indigenous Pentecostal mission churches are not truly indigenous in their mission practice because they continue to cling to Western Pentecostal theology and mission practice. Most of these churches and leaders receive huge funds from the West, which makes them submit themselves to the hegemony of the Western mission practice. Gospel for Asia is not at all an indigenous movement in its mission practice. Since the West fully funds it, there is a Western imperial aggression in the mission movement, and its impact on people of other faiths is minimal. These indigenous mission churches, especially GFA, have been working among the poor, marginalized, Dalits, and tribals. As per my knowledge, there is no academic written record that these mission churches made any impact on forward caste Hindus in India because they are indigenous in outlook but Western in their mission practice. Hahn, in his PhD research, informs the reader that the state of Kerala is at the forefront in initiating indigenous missions, which spread to northern Indian states. His analysis shows, Christian leaders from Kerala established 46 mission agencies centered in 14 states of India and 1 union territory, 32 present of all Indian mission agencies. Some of the significant Keralite-initiated missions identified by Hahn are All India Prayer Fellowship, Christian Fellowship Center, Emmanuel Bible Institute Ministries, Fellowship of Pentecostal Churches, Gospel in Action Fellowship, Indian Evangelical Team, India Gospel Outreach, Indian Inland Mission, India Pentecostal Church Northern Region, and Native Missionary Movement. All of these identified mission agencies have cross-cultural mission vigor, and most of their headquarters are located in North India, but a common characteristic of all churches mentioned above is that their leadership is in the hands of Syrian Christians. Caste stigma is one of the predominant factors in the indigenous missions in India. Even today, the transmission of leadership always falls into the founder's caste group, clan, or kin in some of the mission agencies. Apart from the Pentecostal indigenous missions, Brethren missions also played a vital role in the expansion of the Church in South India. Like Pentecostal missions, Brethren missions had their origin in the West. Still, these Brethren missions in South India try to function as indigenous missions in India, but their mission theory and practice resemble Western missions. Bhaskaran Azokan brings out the fact that Brethren churches in South India functioned as indigenous missions in their mission practice. He describes the significant growth of an indigenous type of Brethren churches in the states of Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka. These Brethren missions emphasized the indigenous way of worship with indigenous instruments, street preaching, and systematic Bible teaching, which attracted people to Christian faiths. These Brethren and Pentecostal movements tried to function as indigenous mission movements, but they heavily depended on the West for their theology and mission strategy. These movements are Western in origin. Therefore, they imported Western theology and mission practice to the land of India. The state of Tamil Nadu is known for its significant indigenous mission agencies. Tirunelveli Diocese of the CSI played a vital role in the emergence and growth of the indigenous missions that spread to several other states in India. Azariah is one of the dynamic leaders from this diocese who initiated indigenous missions in our Indian context, and he was instrumental in the formation of the National Missionary Society, NMS, in 1903 and the Indian Missionary Society, NMS, in 1905. Modern indigenous missions such as FMBP and IEM have come into existence through the initiation of Tamil Christian leaders. Sam Kamalesan, Theodore Williams, P. Samuel, and Satya were some of the prominent Tamil leaders who were behind the formation of these mission movements. These Tamil-initiated indigenous missions also continued their mission among the Dalits, tribals, and marginalized people, and their impact on forward caste groups is questionable. Azariah's mission work had been concentrated on tribals in Dornakal of Andhra Pradesh. There is no record that he neither made any efforts to reach upper sections of people nor attempted to reach urban Indians. His initiated IMS and NMS also has been doing the same thing. The coastal Andhra Pradesh has a significant role in the emergence and expansion of indigenous missions. Krishna, Guntur, East Godavari, and West Godavari districts have several indigenous missions that made some efforts to witness forward caste Hindus. Bakht Singh Mission, Bible Mission, Banjara Tribal Missions, Layman's Evangelical Fellowship, and Gospel Association of India are a few indigenous missions movements in AP that can be discussed over there. Bakht Singh, Devadas. The founder of Bible Mission, and Subbarao developed some indigenous theology through their songs and writings. Since they rejected Western funding, mission practice, and theology, they could make some impact on people of other faiths. In his book Quest for Identity, Hedlund gives a huge list of indigenous missions in coastal Andhra Pradesh that have emerged. Visakhapatnam and Hyderabad are the two urban centers which indigenous missions have influenced. Emmanuel Paspula's article on indigenous churches in Hyderabad gives a few details of indigenous missions' emergence and growth in the Hyderabad district. Christ's Church, Upper Room, and New Testament Church are the three major indigenous churches that are growing with indigenous mission fervor in the city of Visakhapatnam. Pentecostal indigenous missions made a tremendous impact in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Church of God, Full Gospel, in India, World Mission Evangelism of India, Manna Full Gospel Church, and New Testament Church of India are some of the significant churches that are making an impact. The indigenous missions fervor can be found in various groups and movements such as all-night prayer groups, Holiness Brothers, Full Gospel Followers, New Life Associations, and Hosanna Assemblies in Andhra Pradesh. These indigenous churches and missions movements are church-based missions, but their contribution to the geographical expansion of the Christian faith is quite significant. These indigenous missions are vigorous in evangelism and church planting, but most of these movements are working among the Dalits and rural folk. In the state of Karnataka, the Christian mission has its roots in the coming of the London Missionary Society, Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society, and Basel Evangelical Missionary Society. These Western missions expanded the church in Karnataka. Vijay Kumar, in his published research on the ecumenical cooperation of the missions in Karnataka, helps us to understand the fact that Western missions could have been more successful in ecumenical unity for the effective Christian witness in Karnataka. The Western mission agencies in the region did not encourage indigenous leadership, which might be the cause of the slackness in the progress of the work in the state of Karnataka. Vijay Kumar informs the fact that Basel Mission from the beginning of its preamble, the constitution stressed that previously there had been no recognition in the BEMS for any indigenous leadership. The study shows the fact that indigenous missions' emergence and expansion is a bit slow in the state of Karnataka, which might be one of the reasons for the lukewarm Christian witness in the state. In conclusion of this section, Barnabas' rationale can be helpful in understanding the geographical expansion of the mission in India. His rationale is that the spiritual revival that occurred in CSI initiated indigenous missions with a vision for cross-cultural missions. Revival in sodality-structured churches gave birth to modality-structured indigenous missions in India. Barnabas gives evidence for his arguments, and he convinces the reader that most of the indigenous mission movements in South India were initiated and started by the faithful church members of CSI. The emphasis on cross-cultural missions stimulated indigenous missions to cross their boundaries and states to expand the gospel to unreached states. Most of the indigenous missions of South India gave priority to expanding the gospel to North Indian states. Barnabas informs, at least 440 indigenous Indian mission organizations are sending out more than 44,000 missionaries, 66% of whom are working cross-cultural in India. The reason behind sending more missionaries to unreached North Indian states is that the modality-structured churches of South India had been challenged with unreached statistics and the rationale for the need in North India. The church members, who were convinced and inspired by the persuading mission challenges in mission conferences in South India, moved to North India as full-time workers and tent makers. As a result, the mission work in North India started expanding. 2.1.2 North India. North India has been the resisting region towards the gospel for the past many centuries. Raj Bahadur Sharma brings out the fact that the Church of England, American Presbyterian Missions, and the American Methodist Episcopal Missions initiated mission work in North India. Still, these mission initiatives couldn't influence the Hindu community because of their Western method of approach. The emergence of indigenous missions triggered the growth of the Church in North India. Still, most of the indigenous missions that emerged and expanded into North Indian states have their origin back in South India. Vidyasagar J. Dogar makes it clear that the emergence of Christianity in northwest India has its roots in the people movements that occurred in the 20th century among the Dalits who were oppressed for centuries by the forward caste people. The people's movements strengthened and empowered the Christian community, which is mostly a Dalit Christian community. In fact, about 90% of the rural church in northwest India shares this background. Dogar evaluates the Western order of Christianity in the region and says that the Dalits, who were not in a position to conceptualize highly westernized Christian theology, did not experience religious transformation. Since the Western missions failed to incarnate their mission to the people of the land, the indigenous people attached all sorts of magical and supernatural powers to the religious objects like the Bible, the cross, the altar, and even the priest, just as they did in the past to anything religious or mysterious to their mind. This problem is not only with the Dalit community, as mentioned by Dogar, but it's the problem of the other sections of the society in India. Punjab is one of the North Indian states where the indigenous missions made a tremendous impact in missions. Indigenous missions such as the Indian Pentecostal Church of God, the Pentecostal Mission, the Indian Evangelical Team, IET, Beersheba Church of God, FMPB, and Youth with a Missions have been actively involved in the state of Punjab. The IET emerged in 1977 with a vision to serve the people of Punjab and Jammu Kashmir. FMBP initiated its service in 1974. Most of the missions were stationed at Pathankot and Chandigarh. The significant observation by Kathatu is that indigenous mission organizations are very actively witnessing to non-Christians in the state. In the state of Kashmir, there are at least 2 indigenous Indian missionary agencies emerged: Kashmir Evangelical Fellowship, KEF, founded at Udhanpur by P.M. Thomas in L973, and the Indian Evangelical Team, IET, begun by P.G. Varghese at Katra in 1974. These indigenous mission agencies made a significant impact in North India. Still, most of all, the significant indigenous missions that expanded in North India have South India in their origin and leadership. In fact, the South Indian leadership monopolizes Christian missions in North India. The Christian missions in the post-independent era brought several changes in northwest India because of the forceful withdrawal of Western missionaries from India. They had to transfer the leadership to the indigenous people, which is one of the reasons for the development of indigenous missions in the region. Mostly, the traditional churches such as CSI, CNI, and Methodist are Western in origin, but they are functioning as indigenized missions in North India. Jesudas M. Athiel, in his study Relevant Patterns of Christian Witness in India, 2000, acknowledges this fact and gives his rationale for the emergence of indigenous missions in the post-independent era. The traditional denominational churches were competitive in their missions approach and they were not relevant and effective up to 1947. Still, the post-independence era brought a revolutionary change in Indian missions. Parachurch mission movements contributed to the expansion of the Christian mission in most of the North Indian states. Indigenous missions, which South Indian charismatic leaders initiated, expanded to the north with cross-cultural vigor, and they made a tremendous impact in North India. Mission agencies such as IEM, FMBP, IET, and GEMS expanded to several North Indian states, and their contribution to evangelism, church growth, and social transformation is quite significant. Augustine Jabakumar, the founder of GEMS, adopted a holistic concept of mission, which involves vigorous evangelism, church planting, and social transformation in the state of Bihar. The natives well accept his mission, and there is tremendous church growth. The FMBP and FACOR's contribution to the social transformation of the Maltis in Bihar is an amazing work to illustrate the Indigenous Missions' contribution to social transformation. Dason's PhD dissertation illustrates the FMBP's contribution to the transformation of the Adivasis of South Gujarat. In his study, Dason does a detailed study of Indigenous missions in South Gujarat, which made a tremendous impact on social transformation. The Church of Brethren Mission and Wesleyan Methodist Church had their origin in the West, but their mission methods and approach are indigenous in South Gujarat. The other mission agencies, such as FMPB, Gujarat Missionary Movement, IEM, ECI, and Pentecostal Missions, have been making an incredible impact on the Adivasis of South Gujarat. In the state of Madhya Pradesh, Zoram Baptist Mission, ZBM, initiated the mission work in 1978. The mission adopted social service as a means to relate to the people of the land. Medical service, school ministry, library, and reading rooms opened opportunities to expand the church. Mutha Missions, which was initiated by Pandita Ramabai, has been a blessing in the state of Maharashtra. It is one of the indigenous missions in India, which has been focusing on a holistic mission with a liberative motif. Narayan Tilak was one of the early Brahmin disciples of Christ who made efforts towards the indigenous expression of Christian witness in Maharashtra. He established Christaka Darbar, a Christian ashram that consists of both Christian believers and non-believers. Several indigenous missions emerged in the state during this post-independence era. Maharashtra Village Ministry, MVM, is one such indigenous mission to illustrate the emergence and growth of indigenous missions in Maharashtra. Reverend D.B. Kalathungan, along with other Union Biblical Seminary students of Yavatmal, founded this movement in 1981. It has nearly 85 workers and 24 congregations. The movement has been influencing the village folks of Maharashtra. Another indigenous mission in Maharashtra that practices holistic mission is the Inheritors. The vision of the Inheritors is to provide holistic care for families and the first-generation Christians through teaching, training, and nurture to establish them in Christian love. These case studies help us to understand the fact that indigenous Indian missions are not only vigorous and committed to the expansion of the Christian Church, but at the same time, they are committed to the needs of the society in which they exist. 2.1.3 Northeast India. In the context of Northeast India, a spiritual revival that broke out in the early 20th century prepared the way for the emergence of the indigenous churches. Churches of Indigenous Origins in Northeast India, edited by O. L. Snatang, has 10 articles that explain the growth of indigenous Christianity in Northeast India. The Full Gospel Fellowship is one of the indigenous mission movements that made a significant impact in the region. Barnold Wankar informs that Roy K. Raji initiated Full Gospel Fellowship in 1977 with a vision to expand indigenous churches in the state of Meghalaya. Initially, the movement followed the sodality mission structure with a parachurch mission model, and later on, it turned to church structure for administration purposes. One of the hallmarks of Northeast Indian Christian missions is that the church is self-propagating and mission-sending. Kuriakose informs the fact that many of the tribals are working cross-culturally and have even opted to work outside the region. The existing church in Northeast India started sending missionaries outside their region. Hrankuma's chapter on Indigenous Mission and Northeast India in Indigenous Missions of India, edited by Hedlund and Hrankuma, gives a detailed geographical expansion of indigenous missions in the states of Meghalaya, Assam, Nagaland, Manipur, Tripura, Mizoram. One of the observations from the context of the northeastern state is that denominational churches initiated indigenous mission work, and they functioned as indigenous missions to some extent. For instance, the Nagaland Baptist Church Council, which was formed in 1937, practiced its mission as an indigenous mission and emphasized cross-cultural evangelism and indigenous church planning. Christianity is Indian, edited by Hedlund, does not have a single article on Northeast India. This shows that proper documentation and written literature on indigenous missions in Northeast India is very much neglected. The published research Emergence and Growth of Baptist Churches among the Tangsas of Arunachal Pradesh by Molam Ronrang has a chapter that deals with church growth in Arunachal Pradesh from 1974 to 1993, which is relevant to the present study. The genesis of the Christian missions in Arunachal Pradesh has its roots in the Baptist mission, which came to the state in 1841. The Western missionaries planted the Christian church, but the significant thing in Northeast India, especially in Arunachal Pradesh, is that the native workers are the ones who expanded the church in the regions. The modality structures of the existent Western church initiated the indigenous mission within their framework. The indigenous workers initiated the church's growth. The ABAM, AO Baptist Aragomung Dang, mission has its origin from the West, but it had completely come into the indigenous structure and indigenous leadership by 1980. Ronrang believes that it is because of the people movement that started in 1969 that the indigenous church expanded in Arunachal Pradesh. The native people took up the call of God to witness their people, and they were trained in theological schools for better indigenous admission. In the context of the state of Tripura, the year 1973 is quite significant because foreign missionaries left the state by handing over the church to indigenous leadership. The native leaders proved their caliber to manage the missions, and they took it further to expand the church in Tripura. Deb Arma, who researched the origin and growth of Christianity in Tripura, informs, since the withdrawal of the foreign missionaries from the state, the church has continued to grow in every respect. The withdrawal of foreign missionaries made necessary the emergence of indigenous missions. The established modality-structured church turned into the sodality-structured church with an indigenous flavor. In the state of Nagaland, which is known for its Christian faith, Naga indigenous missions made a tremendous impact on its culture and society. Ao Nagas were the first tribe who encountered the Christian gospel before any other tribe in the state welcomed the gospel message. American Baptist Mission entered into the state for the first time in 1871 by the initiation of an American Baptist missionary named E. W. Clark. The early 20th century experienced a mighty revival in the state of Nagaland, which resulted in tremendous church growth. Imna Wapang writes, the indigenous Naga mission work began as early as the foundation of Christianity in Nagaland. A self-initiation movement led to indigenous missions in the state. By the mid-20th century, native missionaries took an active role in Christian missions. The Nagaland Baptist Church Council was formed in 1953, which was a turning point for the indigenous missions in the state. According to Imna Wapang, the spiritual revival that broke out in 1974 revived the church and there was significant church growth. Another factor for the growth of indigenous missions in Nagaland is that the post-independence era opened opportunities for charismatic indigenous missions to the state. For instance, the Ceylon Pentecostal Mission, CPM, which is one of the indigenous mission movements of South Indian origin, entered Nagaland after the independence. The Nagaland Christian Revival Church, NCRC, which is an indigenous mission, emerged from Longkam and Mangmatong village in 1948. Apart from a few indigenous mission movements, it is mostly the existing Western Baptist Church, which turned into an indigenous mission in Nagaland. Chapter 3. The vitality of indigenous missions in India cannot be fully grasped without examining the socio-cultural and religious ecosystems in which they operate. While theology and historical development have laid a firm foundation, the dynamics of mission must now be understood in relation to India's complex societal structures, particularly its caste hierarchies, ethnic diversities, linguistic plurality, and deeply entrenched religious worldviews. Chapter 3 explores how indigenous missions engage, confront, and adapt to these lived realities not in theory, but in practice. It highlights how mission fields are shaped not just by geography, but by history, ideology, and power. At the heart of this chapter is the conviction that no mission exists in a vacuum. Indigenous missions thrive or falter based on how sensitively and courageously they navigate the tensions between gospel proclamation and cultural engagement. This includes negotiating the fault lines of caste discrimination, gender inequality, religious nationalism, and urban migration. Rather than offering a static analysis, this chapter seeks to present a missiological map tracing both the obstacles and the openings that define the everyday work of indigenous Christian witness across India. In doing so, it invites a deeper appreciation of mission as an embodied, contextual, and often contested practice. 3 contextual factors that contributed to the emergence of indigenous missions in India. The emergence and growth of indigenous missions in India have a strong connection with the contextual factors that are related to socio-political, economic, religious, and nationalistic consciousness. India has its local contexts that prepared a way for the emergence of indigenous missions. Many contextual changes happened during the late 19th century that eventually opened the way for the mushroom of indigenous missions in India. 3.1 Political context. The political context is one of the main reasons for the emergence of indigenous missions in India. The Western missions in India monopolized Christian missions with their superior spirit. Christians in India are considered colonial agents because of colonial rule and Christian mission, who worked hand in hand, and it is understood that to missionize is to colonize and to colonize is to missionize. Colonial political and spiritual activities in India have positive as well as negative impacts on the people of India who belong to different cultures. Since colonizers and missionaries sailed on the same boat, gun and gospel were carried on the same ship, these two institutions have worked together ultimately with one motive to lord over the land and its people. Post-colonial thinkers like Dharmaraj view these two systems, colonialism and Christian mission, as one entity. He further argues, mission and colonialism, in effect, favored and facilitated each other and helped carry out certain ideologies over others. Thus, even their good works, such as English education and other services, have been understood as a means to conquer the people of India. The Hindu society in India misunderstood the Christian faith as a white man's religion because of the colonial cultural aggression and their attitude toward the indigenous people. Another observable missiological problem in the colonial mission in India is that they should have raised local leadership. In fact, they were only willing to transfer the leadership for a few decades. The Church Missionary Society, CMS, in India took steps to raise the local leadership, but they had apprehensions about the native leadership due to their failure in the African Church. CMS experimented with Henry Venn's indigenous principles in Africa and ordained Samuel A. J. E. Crowther as the first non-European bishop in 1864. He was the most successful bishop in the African context, and his contribution to Bible translation in the vernacular language, native leadership training, relational and cross-cultural witness, education, and attitude to indigenous religions and cultures had been remarkable. CMS replaced a European missionary after his death by their unfair evaluation of native leadership. The first attempt by the non-European bishop was interpreted as a failure. The European missionaries complained that it was too early to hand over the episcopal authority to the native leaders, which is why Western missions in India were hesitant to hand over their missions to the indigenous people. Indian Christians had to go through tough times because of their association with foreign missionaries. In fact, Indian Christians were misunderstood as pro-British, anti-Indian, and non-patriotic. In order to be relevant to the times of the day, Western churches were pressured to raise native leadership. Some of the Western missionaries encouraged native leadership and native missions. Bishop Azariah is one among such privileged Indian leaders who were mentored and encouraged to lead by the white missionaries. The political developments in India, especially the freedom struggle, forced the British government to leave the country, and eventually, India gained independence on August 15, 1947. In late 1954, the Indian cabinet introduced a new policy and guidelines for foreign missionaries. There were many restrictions for the foreign missionaries to stay back to continue the mission work. Missions had to be sponsored by Indian church organizations by the new law that the Indian government introduced. This political shift forced white missionaries to leave the country. The foreign missionaries were withdrawn gradually. As a result, Indian Christians got the opportunity, and they were motivated to become involved in missions. Barnabas identifies two of the major political reasons that contributed to the emergence of indigenous missions. One of the factors that contributed to the growth of indigenous missions is political restrictions on conversions. The Indian government, after the independence, made several laws to restrict Christian work in India. One of the stratagems they made was restricting constitutional privileges to the Dalit Christian converts. The scheduled caste, SC, Dalits who converted to Christian faith were not given reservation privileges. Another restriction was the area of visas for foreign missionaries. Foreign missionaries were restricted from entering India for mission work. These two major political restrictions made by Indian Christians are alert to the spiritual needs of the country. Barnabas believes that these restrictions became a blessing to the Indian Church because these issues became one of the important motivating factors for the commitment of many Christians for full-time work and the formation of many missions in India. Barnabas' evaluation can come close to the truth because necessity is the mother of invention. Indigenous missions became indispensable to carrying out the mission work that was initiated by the Western missions and to reach the unreached people groups of India. 3.2 Social context. India is one of the particular countries with diversity in culture, language, geography, caste, communities, religions etc. The early missionaries of the West needed help relating with the people of India, who belonged to varied cultures. The Indian mission history reveals the fact that most of the Western missionaries concentrated on the responsive people groups, mostly Dalits and tribals, who turned to the Christian faith as masses. Indian people responded to the gospel as people groups because they found dignity when they embraced the Christian faith as groups. Each people group is distinct in the Indian context. Similarly, indigenous mission agencies emerged from different people groups. Ezra Sargunam states, after the independence, more particularly just during the last decade, well over 300 mission agencies have come into existence and over 100 of them are fully supported and financed by the Indian churches. Most of these indigenous missions in India concentrate on village folks and downtrodden sections of the people. One of the reasons might be the social context of India. Because it is estimated that of the 850 million of our people of whom 80% are living in 620,000 villages. In order to witness the Christian faith in India, hundreds of indigenous missions came into existence. Most of the indigenous missions in India came into existence with an emphasis on reaching the unreached in the context of sociologically backward sections of the people. For instance, the so-called significant indigenous missions such as IEM, FMPB, GEMS, IET, and many more have come into existence with the notion of reaching the unreached. The mission term unreached is mostly interpreted in the context of sociologically underprivileged sections of the people groups. It is a common tradition in Indian mission conferences to challenge the participants by showing the figures of unreached interior people who are not accessible to the gospel. Most of the indigenous mission leaders were inspired by this notion of mission challenge. As a result, indigenous mission leaders have come up with a vision to reach the unreached. IEM came into existence because of this notion of unreached. Esther Williams, in her book Sacrifice or Investment, 1985, gives a detailed history of IEM. According to Esther's description, Theodore Williams, the founder of IEM, made some survey trips on the hills of Tamil Nadu, Sikkim, and Orissa, which inspired him to initiate a mission to reach these unreached. IEM came into existence at EFI's Devlali conference in 1965 with an emphasis on reaching the unreached tribals. The Indian social condition is one of the motivating and inspiring factors behind the emergence of many of the indigenous missions in India. Different people groups, language, and regional groups have their homogeneous mission groups. Regional diversities and differences opened ways for the mushrooming of indigenous missions that are comfortable to their class, caste, and ethnic diversities. The social evil, caste, is one of the dominating factors in the Indian mission fields even today. Different caste groups have their denominations, churches, and mission agencies. We can observe this phenomenon very much in South India. Some of the indigenous missions adopted this caste group approach to reach their particular castes. In the state of Andhra Pradesh, several indigenous missions support this caste-based mission work. Maranatha Visvesa Samajam, an indigenous mission, was started in 1982 in the city of Vijayawada with a vision to reach a forward caste community called Chowdhuries. Their actual caste is Kama in Telugu. Pastor Moses, who belongs to the Chowdhury/Kama caste, started the movement, and the focus of the movement is on that particular caste community. 3.3 Economic context. The political changes that happened after the independent era brought a lot of challenges and changes in the economic context of the Church in India. The foreign support for the Indian missions gradually decreased, and the Indian Christians had to raise indigenous funds for the mission work in India. The Church that enjoyed the foreign support started developing indigenous funds for its mission work. This economic context is one of the significant factors for the emergence of indigenous missions. Indigenous resources were encouraged and self-support concept was overemphasized among the Indian missions. Indigenous charismatic Christian leaders like Azariah emphasized self-support in their indigenous mission approach. Having the CMS administrative background, Azariah emphasized on self-support principle in his mission work, but at the same time, he was not against receiving the foreign fund. He stimulates the Indian Church to be active in financial giving. This self-support concept encouraged the Indian Christians to start several indigenous missions. Indigenous mission agencies such as the Indian Missionary Society of Tinnevelly, 1903, and the National Missionary Society, 1905, came into existence through this self-support policy. Modern missions like IEM, FMBP, BYM and many other indigenous mission agencies emerged with the indigenous funding. If the economic context had not been changed in India, the Indian Church would have been under the monopoly of the Western Church even to this day. 3.4 Religious context. The post-independence India witnessed a great revival in the Church. The modality-structured Church, CSI in South India, and CNI in North India went through a spiritual revival that prepared a way for the emergence of indigenous missions in India. In the context of Northeast India, spiritual revival boosted the indigenous missions that have been making a tremendous impact in the region. Edwin Orr did a systematic study on evangelical awakenings in Asia. This study informs the fact that spiritual revival in the Church was a global phenomenon. The emergence of indigenous missions is not only an Indian occurrence, but it is a global fact during the late 19th and middle 20th centuries. When the Western missionaries were compelled to leave Northeast India, there were apprehensions about its survival, but the Church multiplied with indigenous flavor. The indigenous Christian leaders owned the vision to reach their tribals to establish indigenous churches. 3.5 The context of Indian nationalism. Christians played a very important role in the Indian Renaissance in the 19th century. This spirit of Renaissance prepared a way for nationalism in the Indian minds. The Indian national movement spread rapidly with the revolt of 1857. In fact, Christian education helped Indians to challenge their superstitious beliefs and social evils. The Christian colleges in different parts of the country enlightened the Indian youth with Christian values, which ultimately prepared them as leaders of the Indian nation. The elite sections of the Indians were exposed to English education and they got into higher positions in the British government, which prepared a way for them to raise nationalism. The developmental projects of the Christians uplifted the discriminated outcasts and Dalits. As a result, the underprivileged sections of the country could get into government jobs. Indian Christians were tolerant of their neighbors who belonged to different faiths. The predominant argument from the Christian literature is that Christian contribution to the social, political, economic, and religious life of Indians enlightened and empowered Indian minds to develop a nationalistic consciousness. The English education helped Indians to read the history of the French Revolution, the American War of Independence, etc., that prepared the Indian minds to raise their voice for freedom. These waves of nationalistic spirit enlightened and inspired Indian Christian thinkers. Indigenous Christian movements such as Calcutta Christo Samaj, 1887, National Church of Madras, 1886, Lucknow Christian Association, 1892, and Pune Christians Association were formed as a result of nationalism in India. Individual charismatic Indian Christian leaders such as K.T. Paul, S.K. Datt, P. Chenchia, V. Chakare, S.K. George, P.A. Thangasamy, Kali Sharan Banerjee, C.G. Nath, Peter Paul Pillai, Dr. R. B. Manikam, V.S. Azariah, and many more leaders like this caliber can be called as spokesmen for their country. Some of these leaders had been actively involved in the Indian National Congress in the initial days, but the European missionaries discouraged them when the movement turned to political freedom. As a result, Indian Christian contribution to political freedom was passive, but their contribution to the socio- and economic development proved their love for the country. Azariah's love for his nation motivated him to work towards the indigenization of the Church in India. His passion for indigenization empowered him to establish the Indian Missionary Society of Tinnevelly in 1903 and the National Missionary Society in 1905. Eventually, this nationalistic consciousness empowered and motivated Indian charismatic Christian leaders to initiate indigenous missions that are relevant to the local context. The emergence of indigenous missions is a global phenomenon. The global political and nationalistic consciousness enlightened nationals to start national mission movements. Indian indigenous missions came into existence due to socio-political, economic, and nationalistic consciousness. The withdrawal of foreign missionaries made the Indian Church necessary to raise indigenous missions in order to continue the work of the Lord in India. The post-independence era opened doors for the indigenous spirit in the Indian Christians. As a result, the Indian leaders started several indigenous missions with indigenous principles. 3.6 Theological factors. An indigenous mission is biblical, and the Bible clearly supports the principles of indigenous missions. The New Testament Church is indigenous in its nature because it emerged within an indigenous context. The Book of Acts clearly depicts the fact that the Church should function with indigenous principles. The newly emerged Church in the New Testament had to blend its theology that Judaism influenced. In fact, the New Testament writers used theological terms that are familiar to the indigenous context. For instance, John used the concept of logos, which is familiar to the indigenous context. The Western missionaries were not able to use indigenous theology for an effective communication of the gospel. The Western terminologies and the high theological jargon could not attract the people of other faiths in India because the theology they imported was westernized Christian theology, which made it difficult for the indigenous people to conceptualize theological thought. In order to be relevant to the Indian context, indigenous theology is essential for Indian Christianity. 1.2.6.1 Indigenous theology. Indian Christians need an indigenous theology that is relevant to the indigenous people. Indigenous missions in India try to develop their indigenous theology that is relevant to the Indian context without diluting biblical theology. People like Sadhu Sundar Singh opposed Western theological jargon, and he used simple illustrations in his communication to explain the truth to the rural Indians. Hedlund argues that there is no universal theology as such. Theology shapes and develops in a local context. In the Indian context, the real struggle is to develop a Christology that can appeal to pluralistic minds. Sadhu Sundar Singh developed a Christocentric approach to relate with the Indian Hindu minds. Father Devadas, the founder of Bible missions in Andhra Pradesh, developed a Christocentric indigenous theology that has been attracting crowds from different segments of the people. Bible missions emerged out of indigenous theological factors. Several charismatic indigenous missions also came into existence in the context of relating the gospel to indigenous theology. Indian Hindu theology gives priority to the supernatural powers and the spirit world. Miracles, dreams, healing, and foretelling are a part of Indian theology. In order to be relevant to the Indian theological factors, indigenous Christian missions emerged with a theology that was relevant to the Indian crowds. Solomon Raja's research on Bible mission, one of the indigenous missions in Andhra Pradesh, reveals the fact that theological factor is the main reason for its emergence. Devadas was a lay preacher in a Lutheran mission in coastal Andhra Pradesh. The indigenous mission approach that emphasized healing, miracles, and dreams compelled him to go away from the mainline Lutheran missions because his mission practice was not accepted. Theological factor became one of the reasons for the emergence of the Bible mission. In the same way, several indigenous missions emerged out of theological reasons. 3.7 The leadership factors. Some of the indigenous mission leaders contributed in a significant manner to the emergence and growth of indigenous missions in India. Bishop Azariah is one among such charismatic indigenous Christian leaders. His name is mentioned repeatedly because of his initiation to stimulate Indian missions towards indigenization. Pandita Ramabai is another charismatic woman leader whose contribution to the indigenous mission is remarkable. Ramabai's Mutha mission is indigenous in nature, and it has been working for the holistic development of neglected girls and women. Modern indigenous missions have grown rapidly because of charismatic leaders such as Ben Wadi, Theodore Williams, Theodore Srinivasagam, P. G. Varghese, Augustine Jebakumar, R. Stanley, and many more. These mission leaders stimulated the modality-structured mainline church in India with their persuading mission challenges, which resulted in a cross-cultural mission endeavor. 3.8 Significant mission conferences. International Congress for World Evangelization, Lausanne 1974, is a milestone in global missions. This conference emphasized the urgency of world evangelization without diluting the uniqueness of the gospel. The Lausanne Covenant clearly stated, "We are convinced that this is the time for churches and parachurch agencies to pray earnestly for the salvation of the unreached and to launch new efforts to achieve world evangelization." The thrust on world evangelization among the evangelicals motivated cross-cultural evangelism among the native workers. As a result, indigenous mission emerged with a vision to reach their native people. Mission conferences played a vital role in the emergence of indigenous missions in India. Rajendran argues that indigenous missions rapidly grew after 1965. He highlights the significance of the Devlali Conference, which was held in 1977 for its initiation in the emergence of the India Missions Association. Evangelical movements after 1974 made a tremendous impact on Indian missions. Alls gives a detailed description of significant evangelical missions conferences that made an impact on Indian missions. He makes it clear that mission conferences such as the All India Congress on Mission and Evangelization, Devlali, 1977, All India Christian Communication Seminar, Nagpur 198, All India Conference on Evangelical Social Action, Madras 1979, All India Evangelical Women's Conference, Pune 1979, etc. made an incredible impact on Indian missions. 3.9 Nature and function of indigenous missions. According to Potana's analysis, Indian missions have been trying to avoid the weaknesses of foreign missions to be relevant to the contextual situations. One of the developments in Indian missions is that foreign missionaries' participation in the proclamation of the gospel has been minimized tremendously. The Indian preachers have taken over the lead in the presentation of the gospel according to the Indian context, which is one of the reasons for the effective growth of the Church in India. Indigenous principles are very much in practice in the Indian Church. According to Potana's study, Indian missions are actively functioning in sending the missionaries to the unreached people groups. The sodality-structured mission agencies and modality-structured churches are actively involved in sending the missionaries to unreached places in India. Indian missions are cross-cultural in their nature, and there is a thrust on the North Indian mission field. Most of the indigenous mission agencies in India originated by the initiation of South Indian leaders, but their emphasis is on North Indian outreach. Tirunelveli district of Tamil Nadu itself supported several indigenous mission agencies, and hundreds of cross-cultural missionaries had been sent out to North Indian states from this district. Jayaprakash's research informs that there were 1,144 cross-cultural workers in the 82 indigenous Indian mission agencies, about 38% of the Indian missionary personnel work cross-culturally, 1,144 out of 3,017. One of the reasons for the tremendous focus on cross-cultural missions is that parachurch mission agencies have been challenging the Indian churches towards cross-cultural missions. Church planting is another significant part of missions. It needs to be discussed to understand the Indian missions. Indian missions have been succeeding in church planting in unreached places. Nevertheless, the drawback of Indian missions is that their focus is on the Dalits and tribals. Most of the Indian missions concentrate on Dalits and tribals, who are a minority in the Indian population compared to Hindus and Muslims. Indian missions are not yet ready to relate to the people of other faiths. 3.10 Important issues related to missionaries. Indian missions are on their way to developing member care in their mission agencies. Missionaries on the field need more pastoral care by the sending mission agencies. Contextual training is another important issue in the mission field. Missionaries in India are not well equipped with contextual mission models to relate to people of other faiths in the Indian context. The training curriculum and methodology are still under Western influence. The missionaries in the mission field go through a lot of external and internal pressures related to their work and future security. Indian missions are yet to be systematized in their future security to the missionaries. Very few mission agencies have systematic policies to take care of their missionaries after their retirement. Unexpected catastrophes and chronic diseases are common among Indian missionaries. Apart from some mission agencies, most of the mission agencies in India do not have a systematic medical and future benefit fund for their missionaries, which is one of the major concerns in the Indian missions. Regionalism, caste, language barriers, and biased feelings are pulling down the quality of Indian mission agencies. There is a constant tension between North Indian and South Indian regional feelings in the mission boards. Conclusion. The literature survey informs the fact that indigenous mission movements emerged in South India and expanded to North Indian states. The spiritual revival was one of the reasons for the emergence and growth of indigenous missions in South as well as northeastern states. There is ample literature available regarding the geographical emergence and expansion of indigenous missions in India. God is faithful in raising indigenous mission movements in South and Northeast India. Still, most of these movements are duplicating the Western missions approach because they follow Western mission theories and strategies. The emergence of indigenous missions is a global phenomenon. The global political and nationalistic consciousness enlightened nationals to start national mission movements. Indian indigenous missions came into existence due to socio-political, economic, and nationalistic consciousness. The withdrawal of foreign missionaries made it necessary for the Indian Church to raise indigenous missions in order to continue the work of the Lord in India. The post-independence era opened up opportunities for the indigenous spirit in the Indian Christians. As a result, the Indian leaders started several indigenous missions with indigenous principles, but still, they hang on to the Western mission praxis. Chapter 4. Evaluation is an essential component of any mature movement, and indigenous missions in India are no exception. While we have celebrated the theological clarity, historical courage, and contextual creativity of these missions in earlier chapters, this chapter turns our attention to areas that require careful scrutiny, honest reflection, and constructive critique. The purpose of this critical evaluation is not to diminish the sacrifices or sincerity of those involved in indigenous mission efforts, but to strengthen the movement by identifying gaps, challenges, and patterns that may hinder its long-term impact. Just as pruning fosters growth in a healthy tree, so too does honest reflection serve the flourishing of the Church's mission. The observations offered in this chapter are presented with deep respect for the men and women, many of them unnamed, who have poured their lives into the service of Christ in India. The intent is never to assign blame or provoke division, but to invite conversation, reformation, and renewed faithfulness. Readers are encouraged to approach this section not with defensiveness but with discernment, understanding that evaluation is not personal criticism but communal responsibility. In the spirit of grace and truth, we now examine where indigenous missions have been fruitful, where they have struggled, and how they might move forward with even greater clarity, humility, and power. 4. Evaluation of indigenous. 4.1 The early indigenous church, St. Thomas Church. As per the tradition, St. Thomas Christianity is the first indigenous church that had grown in the Indian context. Christian tradition believes that the history of Christianity in India started with St. Thomas's arrival in the 1st century. Even today, the St. Thomas Christian community preserved its identity as a witness that the Christian community in India is an indigenous community. The Nipura reminds us that this community has preserved its Christian faith throughout the centuries in spite of the fact that non-Christians have surrounded them, and rather cut off from the mainstream of the Christian world. Even though the Christian faith has come from outside India, the social life of the Christians has been indigenous. Indian Christianity is an ancient church, but European missionaries destroyed indigenous identity by imposing their Western style of art, culture, music, dress, and cultural practices. According to the Syrian Christian tradition, Apostle Saint Thomas landed at Cranganore, Kodangaluru, on the Periyar estuary north of Cochin, in about 52 AD. There is no accurate historical evidence, but oral traditions of the St. Thomas Church make people believe this tradition. This St. Thomas Church had grown in the midst of struggles on Indian soil. The Nipara points out that the Indian Church of St. Thomas had a vital, organic growth in the midst of the living realities of India. This St. Thomas Christians lived their Christian experience in the Indian context. He further comments that the St. Thomas Church is Indian in culture, Christian in religion, and Oriental in worship. The Nipara's argument can be questioned because it cannot be completely called an indigenous mission. The reason is that the St. Thomas Christians depended on foreign leaders, and they had to use a foreign language to worship. They used foreign liturgy in worship. Therefore, it may not be fully Oriental in worship, but they used the indigenous expression in some aspects. Indian heritage and culture can be seen in the life and faith of the St. Thomas Church. The architecture of the church resembled a Hindu temple. Mund Adon comments, many of the churches of the Christians were built in the same architectural style as the Hindu temples. These constructions survived until the 16th century, and it was only in the 16th century that many were remodeled after the Portuguese style. Some of the cultural customs, such as childbirth, marriage, burial practices, dress, food, etc., are adopted from Hindu cultural practices but give different shapes and meanings in Christian practice. For instance, concerning childbirth ceremonies, Brown records. Immediately after the child was born, it was washed, and then a priest or a male relative would shout in the child's ear, Marang Yesu Masiha, Jesus Christ is Lord, and the child would be fed with 3 drops of honey in which a little gold had been rubbed. This system, shared with Brahmins, was intended to ensure prosperity. It is a type of adoption mission method they adopted in the early days of the Christian faith. The church buildings were constructed resembling Hindu temples, and they tried to relate to the local cultural context by not giving up their social customs and some of the rituals. In the course of history, the apostolic origin of the St. Thomas Church met the Persian Church due to trade. Later, the Indian Church adopted the East Syrian liturgy of the Persian Church. Thus, the Indian Church came under the governance of metropolitans and hierarchies of the Persian Church, then. It must be supposed that Western Christians from the 16th century tried to come into closer relations with the St. Thomas Christians for purely spiritual or ecclesiastical reasons. Western Christianity dominated this church, but it could survive and preserve its distinctive expression of Christian faith. 4.2 Early 20th century indigenous expression of Christianity. The early Western missionaries attempted to establish their Western type of mission denominations and mission agencies in the land of India. Apart from De Nobilis, 1577 to 1656, Adoption Mission Model, Bartolomeo Zejan Boggs, 1682 to 1719, and Sarampuri Trio's holistic concept of missions, there is no other evidence that Western missions worked towards indigenization. The missionaries established their Western type of churches in India. In response to Westernized Christianity, indigenous Indian leaders reacted with an indigenous expression of Christianity in their mission approach. Keshab Chunder Sen, 1838–1884, attempted to indigenize the church. In his Church of the New Dispensation, Sen developed a system of asceticism, rituals, and sacraments, including baptism and a form of communion, in which the elements were rice and water. Sen was interested in something other than missions. He tried to develop an indigenous theory than missions. Hedlund comments, Sen's concern and the purpose behind the Samaj and his Church of the New Dispensation was to disseminate Christian ideals and ideas. Sen did not contribute much to missions in India. Still, his radical ideas and initiation to contextualized theology prepared a way for the Indians to think in terms of contextualization of theology. Narayan Vamantilak, 1862–1919, was another significant indigenous Christian thinker who was a Brahmin poet. He was truly an Indian Christian. He became a disciple of Christ, but he did not give up his Hindu cultural heritage. He gave much importance to Bhajan, Kirtan, Pravachan, and Purana in his worship, which can be called contextualized worship. Tilak left the legacy of indigenous expression of Christian missions through his life and silent witness. Sadhu Sundar Singh, 1889–1929, was the central focus of the indigenous expression of Christianity in India. Sundar Singh actually initiated and was involved in indigenous missionary endeavors, and he advocated indigenous methods in the mission of the Church. In his mission method, Sundar Singh took a positive approach towards people of other religions. In his indigenous mission practice, he didn't plan specific mission work, but it was his breath and lifestyle. According to Sundar Singh, Christianity is the fulfillment of Hinduism. Hinduism has been digging channels. Christ is the water to flow through these channels. The Western missionaries misunderstood his positive attitude toward Hinduism, and the so-called missions in India did not accept him well. His preaching and mission activities are purely indigenous, and he contextualized the mission methods. The village folks well accepted his preaching style and method because his method of preaching in stories, analogies, and parables is also an old Indian tradition of teaching in Upamanas. His mission approach has been a great motivating factor for many of the contemporary indigenous missions. For instance, new Christian movements such as the Layman's Evangelical Fellowship claim a heritage received from Sadhu Sundar Singh. He lived as an Indian and he tried to contextualize the Christian message to the people of India. Rajendra Chandra Das, 1887–1976, is another indigenous contextual theologian who made a tremendous impact on the radical contextual mission method. He is one of the prophets of forgotten indigenous missions. He is highly critical of Western Christianity and distinguished mission from the Church. His mission method, the indigenous ashram method, attracted Hindus. According to Hedlund's evaluation, Das believed the ashram movement as an antidote to the evils of westernized theological education and patterns of ministry. The ashram movement is still active in contemporary mission practice in the South as well as in the North Indian states. 4.4 Mid-20th century missionary movements. The missionary momentum of the mid-20th century created fertile ground for a variety of mission expressions to take root across India. As indigenous movements matured, there arose a growing awareness of the need for structural clarity and missiological intentionality. Many mission agencies that began as small prayer fellowships or church-led outreach initiatives started developing into organized entities with defined leadership, accountability systems, and strategic goals. This period marked the evolution of mission from being a peripheral ministry of the Church to a focused, purpose-driven movement demanding organizational distinctiveness. Out of this dynamic period of growth emerged a deeper recognition of the distinction between local churches and specialized mission structures. While both operated with gospel intent, their operational modes, priorities, and methods began to diverge. The need to mobilize believers across denominational lines, to focus on unreached people groups, and to maintain flexibility in hostile or remote regions led to the formation of mission sodalities. The following section explores this missional architecture, explaining how sodality structures complemented traditional church frameworks and expanded the reach of indigenous missions in strategic and context-sensitive ways. 4.5 Sodality mission structure. The post-independent era mushroomed indigenous independent mission churches, which made a tremendous impact on the Indian masses. These movements were purely indigenous in nature and functioned with missionary zeal to win converts. They followed the Indian style of worship and art, and they incorporated cultural expression of Christianity into their mission practice. 4.1.1 Church of South India, 1947. The Church of South India came into existence to form the indigenous spirit. Western missionaries brought denominationalism through various doctrines and differences. The national leaders like Bishop Azariah felt the need for unity in the church for an effective witness, and they raised their voice for indigenous leadership in the church. The genesis of thought and action for the union of the church can be traced back to the World Missionary Conference in 1910 in Edinburgh. The Church Union Conference that was held at Tranquebar in May 1919 brought many leaders together to think about the unity of the church. 28 years later, the leaders' vision was fulfilled, and the Church of South India came into existence on September 27, 1947. The Church of South India is the union of different churches belonging to different backgrounds, such as Anglican, Methodist, Congregational, Presbyterian, and Reformed. It is organized into 16 dioceses, each under the spiritual supervision of a bishop. The church as a whole is governed by a synod, which elects a moderator for every 2 years. The scriptures are the ultimate standard of faith and practice. The Church of South India has been surviving with biological growth, mostly because of its modality-structured mission. Its contribution to indigenous mission movements such as IEM and FMPB is noteworthy because these mission agencies get native funds mainly from CSI. There is a common notion that CSI churches are dead churches in terms of missions, but it is not true with all the dioceses. There are some dioceses where the church is active in missions in terms of church planting, prayer mobilization, and financial support for the missions. The vision statement of CSI under its Department of Mission and Evangelism states, to stimulate the evangelistic and missionary zeal in the churches with a view of equipping every member to creatively and actively witness the risen Christ and obey his command to make disciples. Therefore, as a church, the CSI has a vision towards missions, and some of the churches are actively involved in Indian missions. 4.1.2 Church of North India, 1970. The roots and support of the formation of the Church of North India also go back to the Ecumenical Mission Conference, Edinburgh 1910. The United Church of North India, UCNI, was formed in December 1924, and it adopted a constitution for itself popularly known as the Blue Book. This union took initiation to bring unity to the church. Invitations for unity went to different churches in the north. As a result, the first roundtable conference was held on 10-11th April 1929 in Lucknow. This meeting paved the way for negotiations for the organic union of churches. In this context, Santram reminds us that the Church of North India evolved out of the union of 6 churches on November 29, 1970. After nearly 40 years of prayer, negotiations, and a quest for the visible unity of the Church in accordance with Christ's prayer that they may all be one, JN 1721. It took a long time for the formation of CNI. The unique thing about the CNI is that at the Fourth Synod held in October 1980, the CNI decided to admit women to the ordained ministry. At present, there are ordained women in the dioceses of Lucknow, Delhi, Calcutta, Sambalpur, Jabalpur, Cuttack, Patna, and Chandigarh. Another significant observation is that CNI practices both infant baptism as well as believers' baptism because of the Baptist churches, which joined with CNI. CNI comes under the modality structure, and its contribution to indigenous missions and evangelism is not effective. 4.1.3 Bible Mission Movement. Mungamuri Devadas, 1875–1960, who is generally known as Father Devadas, is the founder of Bible Mission, an indigenous church movement. Hedlund says, the Bible Mission of Father Devadas was the subject of an in-depth study in the context of indigenous movements in India. At the age of 5 years, Devadas was baptized. He is a Protestant Sannyasi who served the Lord faithfully and brought a great impact on Andhra Pradesh. Devadas came from the background of the Andhra Evangelical Lutheran Church of Rajamundry. He worked with the American Evangelical Lutheran Mission for 46 years as an evangelist, but he wanted more than the then Western method of evangelism. He got a vision directly from the Lord to start an indigenous church movement in the year 1938, and then he moved to a place called Pedakakani near Guntur. His ministry is contextualized with miracles, dreams, and visions. He started a Swasthita Sala, a place of healing at Pedakakani where thousands of Hindus and Muslims regularly come for healing and blessings. It became very popular among Hindus in Andhra Pradesh because of its contextualized method of mission work. The worship service is purely Indian style. Anyone who wants to enter the church should wash their feet at the well, which is located at the entrance of the gate, and everyone sits on the floor. Those who come for miracles will receive a few drops of olive oil in their mouth. They give priority to the ancestral spirits, which would come and minister to the needy, which is why they keep a special chair in every meeting for the spirit of Devatas, hoping that his spirit would manifest and bless the members. Hindus are comfortable with these kinds of practices. Hindu converts are allowed to have some of the customs such as talai, tikka, etc. This movement falls into the uncritical contextualization mission model. The sodality mission structure of this mission has been having good results in people movements, but it is doubtful if some of the practices of the mission are biblical. This movement may not fit into the traditional understanding of mission movements, whose aim is to reach the unreached people of distant cultural, linguistic, and geographical locations. Even though this movement is mainly church-based, it has implications for the Indian missions in the aspect of the indigenous way of practicing Christian missions. This mission movement gives a sense of direction for the indigenous missions to adopt the mission practice that can be relevant to the Indian folk religious crowds. Another significant connection with missions is that the Bible mission has a goal to spread the message of Devatas, and it has the vision to expand the Bible mission church to all parts of the globe. In this context, this movement can be considered a missionary movement because it is missionary in its nature and function. Its mission methods are not the traditional Western type of aggressive conversion model, but it assimilates into the Indian folk religious communities with its distinctive mission methods of healing, prophecy, and casting out demons. The church is expanding and people of other faiths are converting into Christian faith. 4.1.4 Bakht Singh Church Movement. Brother Bakht Singh, 1903-2000, was the first agriculture engineer from India who was converted to the Christian faith in Canada during his engineering studies. He was baptized on February 14, 1932 in Vancouver, Canada. He gave up all his ambitions and landed in India to serve the Lord. Hyderabad Hebron Church is the mother church that he started. Being a Sikh convert, he introduced the Indian style of worship and succeeded in establishing 484 churches in India and 120 churches in other countries. Most of his church members are non-Christian converts. The secret of his success is that he practiced the Indian style of worship. His church is completely indigenous to look as well as in worship pattern. In fact, Bakht Singh's movement was not a counter-movement to the already established denominational churches and missions. He respected and cooperated with existing mission movements, but his mission approach was purely indigenous. His methods are relevant to the Indian Bhakti tradition. He contextualized his methods to attract crowds. He gave much more importance to the devotion than to the denominational traditions that were imported by the Western missionaries. This movement is independent of the West for financial matters. Kashi writes about this movement's stand and says, they resolved that they would be content with whatever he gave and would never give any indication of any need they might have. They would make no appeals and take no subscriptions. From the beginning, this movement had a strong conviction to establish an indigenous church. Bakht Singh rejected all ritualistic practices and hierarchy in the church. This movement believes that indigenization is not Indianization. It simply means applying the New Testament principles of the Church within the cultural background of the people without compromising the Word of God. Further, they believe that indigenization means self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating fellowships under the headship, lordship, and kingship of the Lord Jesus Christ. Another significant factor in this movement is that Bakht Singh's vision of the church was to have local churches that were free of denominationalism and sectarianism in order to show forth the fullness of Christ. This church movement had one of the fastest growths in the past several decades. Still, Bakht Singh's death in 2000 brought crisis due to many divisions and fights within the church. This movement purely followed the sodality mission structure and experienced a great revival, but it is under a crisis because it failed to balance the modality mission structure. Modality and sodality structures should go hand in hand, otherwise, the movements will not survive for a long period. The significant contribution of this movement towards Indian missions is that it spread rapidly into almost all the states of India. The mission fervor of the church stimulated highly employed people to move to North India as tent makers to expand the Christian gospel. This movement made a significant impact in North Indian cities, and its assemblies, churches, were established in cities such as Roorkee, Dehradun, Nagpur, Chandigarh, Ludhiana, Delhi, Noida, Ludhiana etc. The movement is missionary in its nature because it not only spread to North Indian states but also spread to other Asian and Western countries. One of the significant factors of this movement is that it attracted crowds from people of other faiths because of its ways of assimilation and contextualized worship that is relevant to Indian Hindu people and culture. The hallmark of the movement is that it depended on the New Testament pattern of administration and indigenous mission methods. Its theory and mission practice are derived from the indigenous context rather than from the West. The architect of the church's worship pattern, financial dependency, administrative approach, and liturgy are purely indigenous, which attracted the Indians because people of other faiths could see an indigenous way of worship in this movement. 4.1.5 Indigenous Pentecostal Missions Movement. Charismatic churches have made a great impact on the evangelization of India. Especially these charismatic churches penetrated the hardcore Hindu localities. P.T. Abraham addresses this movement as Pentecostal Charismatic Missions, PCM. Pentecostal revival in India first started in Mutha Mission in the year 1905 by the special prayer meetings organized by Ramabai. A.C. George also writes, the Pentecost came to Muthi and its flames spread to other places like Bombay, Pune, Tehand, Aurangabad, Yatmal, etc. Even though Pentecostal movements have spread throughout the country, it had a great impact in the state of Kerala. The Kerala revival produced a strong evangelistic push that culminated in the establishment of numerous missionary outreach movements and significant local Pentecostal churches. Several powerful, charismatic leaders were moving out from the state of Kerala to different states in India with a vision to establish indigenous churches. The significant factor in this charismatic mission movement is that it emphasizes lay leadership, living by faith rather than depending on the West for funds, power encounters, and using spiritual gifts in the ministry. Pentecostal missionaries are jealous of the Lord with zeal and passion to reach the lost with sacrifice. A few of the powerful, charismatic missionaries who scattered from Kerala to other parts of the country were P.M. Samuel to Andhra Pradesh in 1932, M.K. Chacko to Delhi in 1936, P.T. Chacko to Andhra Pradesh in 1936, K.C. Cherian to Karnataka in 1938 and Kurian Thomas to Itarsy in 1945. These influential figures have greatly enhanced the potential of the Indian Church. For example, Kurian Thomas's ministry, which began humbly in Itarsy in 1966, has expanded to 350 languages and founded 360 congregations. India Gospel Outreach planted 24 churches and brought 60 families to Christ in under 15 months. This is just one example to understand the spirit of the movement. There are hundreds of Indian Pentecostal leaders, who did mighty things for the Lord throughout the country. There is a common thread running through each of these Pentecostal churches is a conscious expression of their Indian identity and character. Their Pentecostal faith binds them to fellow believers worldwide. Yet their life and witness at home and in the diaspora are indelibly marked by an Indian identity and character. Pentecostal revival is still alive, and its contribution is remarkable to Indian missions. One of the reasons for the tremendous church growth in this mission movement is that it gives priority to prosperity gospel theory and signs and wonders. Another good thing about this movement is that it balances the tension between sodality and modality. The movement has the structured modality mission approach, but it gives high regard to sodality structure. Hence, natural church growth occurs in the mission. Church growth in India rapidly occurred because of these indigenous charismatic groups. Indian missions have a significant connection with charismatic churches. The charismatic movement is basically a church movement. Still, it functioned as a mission movement that has mission passion for spreading the gospel across the nation in all the unreached places. The Christian gospel spread to all the states in India because of the charismatic initiation and involvement in church planting in unreached places. Therefore, even though it comes under the church movement, it can be considered as a mission movement. 4.1.6 The Layman's Evangelical Fellowship. Layman's Evangelical Fellowship, which is called the Holiness Movement of India, is purely an indigenous mission movement that made a tremendous impact in South India. Brother N. Daniel, who was a schoolteacher, launched his ministry in Andhra Pradesh in the early 20th century. His preaching, indigenous prophetic approach, and miracles attracted crowds. As a result, a mighty revival broke out in Andhra Pradesh, especially in Kakinada and Vishakhapatnam, with a deep conviction of repentance. The scholar Bishop A.J. Appasamy acknowledges, Mr. Daniel showed us clearly and accurately the spiritual poverty and ineffectiveness of our own lives, and he took us to Jesus, where we found new life. All the time he referred us to our Bibles, he made us pray, as we rarely pray, and in prayer, find the blessed assurance of God with us. As I visited villages, I found that the fire was spreading. Bibles were being sold faster than I have seen them sold during the last 10 years, in spirit the high price. Daniel adopted indigenous methods of worship in his mission approach. The movement emphasized personal holiness and spirit of prophecy. For an Indian mind, prophecy is an attractive factor in spirituality, therefore, the spirit of prophecy attracted crowds from Dalits as well as forward caste Hindus. The movement purely depended on indigenous funds for its mission. Whitson Paul, the principal of LEF's training center at Jinnah, informs us the fact. It began in 1935 and is presently functioning in 21 states of India. The people movement theory can be seen in a practical sense in this movement because there were people movements in the mission. People from different groups, segments, and castes converted by the movement, and these converts were spiritually nurtured. This church movement is successful due to its emphasis on the folk religious type of visions, dreams, and healings. The West only influences the movement a little, but the uncritical religious practices confuse the people who come from other faiths. Folk religious practices and overdependency on visions and dreams can be seen as a negative effect on the movement. The leadership is centered on the founder and his family. The indigenous second-line leadership and member care are not seen in the movement, which is the main negative comment on the movement. 4.1.7 Blessing Youth Mission. R. Stanley, a professional engineer, initiated this mission movement with indigenous mission principles. The movement came into existence from the small prayer group in the Alagappa Engineering College, Tamil Nadu. The movement made a great impact on college students, and it developed a distinctive, charismatic indigenous mission among the students. Cross-cultural mission emphasis is given priority, and the main thrust is reaching the unreached people groups. Lay people's participation in mission administration is one of the factors for its success in the mission field. The significance of this movement is that it made a tremendous impact on college students. In fact, student ministry has been the backbone of BYM in its earlier years, but slowly, its focus extended to church planting in unreached places. The small prayer group that was established in Alagappa Engineering College in 1970 formed a gospel team with missionary zeal to reach the unreached students in other colleges and universities. Abraham reports that this small prayer group gave birth to the Full Gospel Young Men's Association, FGMA, in 1971 with an emphasis on the baptism of the Holy Spirit. BYM functioned as a parachurch mission agency, which attracted members from the modality-structured church, CSI. Since Stanley himself was a member of CSI and a renowned speaker in evangelical churches, the movement was well accepted by the church in South India, especially in Tamil Nadu. The distinctive nature of this movement is that its focus was on reaching the unreached. It is a missionary by its nature and function. Cross-cultural evangelism was initiated in 1979 with a few missionaries in the state of Karnataka, and it reached tribals such as Siddhis, Gowda, Lambadi, Gaudi, and Kolimbi. BYM extended its ministry to the North Indian states Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, and Orissa. Therefore, Beom can be considered one of the significant missionary movements that made a tremendous impact in India. 4.1.8 Indigenous Ashram Mission Movements. The concept of ashram refers to the forest dwelling of a person, Caro Karen 1978, 186, and it refers to a hermitage, a place where people devoted their time to meditation, to religious contemplation and austerities. Kanjamala defines ashram as a places of intensive spiritual life and search for God. Elements of traditional Christian monasticism and Hindu monasticism are incorporated into these new experiments. Inculturation of liturgy, spirituality, lifestyle, and dialogue with people of other faiths are among the major concerns of the ashramites. Thus, the modern ashram attracts a religious section of people who are devoted to meditation and deeply commit themselves to a religious experience. In the ancient days, Hindu thinkers like Rabindranath Tagore introduced this ashram method of religious practice. The Christian Church has adopted this concept in mission practice in order to be more relevant. The main reason behind developing the Christian ashram concept in Indian missions is to defend the fact that Christianity is not a foreign religion. Thus, the Christian ashram movement is an attempt to give India an Oriental Christ. It is an attempt at indigenization of the Christian faith. The ashram is the place where one can find peace because Christ offers peace to the world. People like Stanley E. Jones encouraged an indigenous approach to evangelism, and he was bold enough to speak on de-westernizing the gospel, immerging it in Indian cultural and philosophical forms and structures. He introduced the Christian ashram concept and established the first ashram in 1930 in Sattal, which is located at the bottom of the Himalayan hills in the state of Uttarakhand. This indigenous ashram method of mission model is a kind of sodality mission structure that rejected the established church structure. This model has not influenced the Indian crowds, but its impact on individuals from people of other faiths is significant. Ashram movements attempted to reach people of other faiths by the indigenous ashram approach, which is significant. Raja Savararayan's edited book Vadimekam of Christian ashrams in India comprises 15 ashram movements that made a significant impact on Indian missions. Some of these ashram movements did good mission work before the independent era. The first Indian Christian ashram, Christokula, was founded on March 7, 1921 at Tirupattur, North Arcot Dist, of Tamil Nadu. Since then, the ashram movements have come into existence, and their contribution to missions is significant. Jasudasan, in his article Ideas and Activities of the Christokula Ashram, mentions that Christian ashrams engaged in active rural uplift work through medical and educational work. The significant fact about this ashram mission practice is that it transcended caste, color, language, ethnicity, gender, rich and poor. The modern missions are very much influenced by caste-based leadership and caste consciousness missionaries, but these ashram movements showed a model of Christian unity. Suvartha Premi Samatai is another significant Christian ashram, which was started on the Himalayan hills of Pithoragarh Dist, of Uttarakhand, in the year 1954 with a vision to reach the Tibetans and Indo-Tibetans. This ashram made a tremendous impact in reaching the people on the hills. The other ashrams such as Christ Prem Seva Ashram in Pune, 1970, Christi Yabandha Kulam in MP, 1952, Jyothanikatan Ashram in Bareilly, 1950. Christavashram in Kerala, 1934, Christapanthai Ashram in Sihora, MP, 1942, are some of the examples which made a significant mission practice in India. The medical mission is one of the common practices among all the ashram movements. In fact, these ashrams emerged with an evangelistic fervor, and they were passionate in their early period, but their missionary zeal and passion for evangelism decreased slowly. John Thanikal, who did thorough research on the ashram movements in India, evaluates that Christapanthai Ashram lost its original goal of evangelizing North India. He strongly comments, the Kerala mission has failed to indigenize itself in the cultural situation in Madhya Pradesh. Mardhoma Evangelistic Association established Christapanthai Ashram in the north, which has its strong cultural roots in Kerala, therefore, it could not really assimilate into the North Indian culture. The same thing happened with the other ashram movements in India. 4.6 Modality Mission Structure. The post-independence era gave birth to several indigenous mission agencies, which adopted an indigenous method of training and missional approach in their mission theory and practice. These mission agencies have been mostly functioning under a sodality mission structure. Evangelical Fellowship of India, 1951, played a vital role in the motivation and formation of evangelical indigenous missions in India. One of the hallmarks of these evangelical missions movements is that they give importance to cross-cultural mission work. It is estimated that there are over 50 evangelical mission agencies in India that have substantial ministries. In order to empower these indigenous evangelical movements, the Evangelical Fellowship of India, EFI, came into existence in 1951. The General Secretary of EFI says that it came into existence as a national alliance of evangelical Christians and is a central network of evangelicals in India. EFI is the backbone of the Indian Church, and it attempted to bring together evangelicals from the mainline and fee-side churches. EFI provides fellowship to evangelical Christians by aiming at spiritual renewal, active evangelism, and effective witness. A few of the evangelical missionary movements are discussed below. 4.6.1 Marthoma Evangelistic Association, 1888. Marthoma Evangelistic Association, which was formed in 1888, is the first national indigenous Christian missionary organization in India. This mission emerged out of a spiritual revival that occurred in Malankara Church in 1845. As a result of spiritual revival and reformation, the Malankara Church developed a great concern for the spread of the gospel to unreached places. This movement initiated several other mission associations, such as the Martomasovishya Sevaka Sangam, the Women's Evangelical Association in 1919, and the Men's Voluntary Evangelistic Association in 1924. One of the significant contributions of this Indigenous Mission Association is that it brought about several inventive plans for the spread of the gospel, such as voluntarism, self-supporting voluntary mission service by committed missionaries, ashram movement, parish mission, evangelization of local parish, Sadhu Jatha mission, mission among the backward class, Videsa mission, mission to foreign lands and cultures. 4.6.2 Indian Missionary Society, 1903. The formation of the Indian Missionary Society prepared a way for the indigenization of the Church in India. The IMS has indeed modeled itself after a foreign missionary society committed to indigenization. V.S. Azariah played a vital role in the formation of IMS and he served as its first General Secretary from 1903 to 1908. Azariah emphasized indigenization in art, culture, structure, and liturgy. Under the leadership of Azariah, IMS contribution to the indigenous mission is quite significant. All IMS missionaries learned the vernacular and stressed the importance of cultural continuity after conversion. It emphasized Indian money and Indian leadership, and its objective was to bring mission awareness among the churches to spread the gospel outside Tirunelveli district. IMS stimulated mission zeal and indigenous spirit in the Indian Church. IMS, in its mission station at Dornakal, experienced people's movements. 4.6.3 National Missionary Society, 1905. NMS was founded in 1905 with the initiation and vision of a group of 17 indigenous Christian leaders. Among them were V.S. Azariah, K.T. Paul, and J.W.N. Hensman, who were a few of the outstanding leaders who contributed to its emergence and growth. George Sherwood Eddy's contribution to the formation of this mission movement is significant because he mentored V.S. Azariah. Eddy realized the need for indigenization, and his commitment to Indigenous Mission Agency lay in embryonic appreciation of issues of culture, society, and politics. The NMS depended on Indian resources for its mission work, and it influenced the Christian mission agencies with indigenous principles. The vision of NMS is to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to Indians by Indians with Indian money and through Indian methods. Its ministry has expanded to 17 states of India and a few neighbouring countries with a vision to raise national leaders. Their work has been mainly focused on tribals, fisher folk, Muslims, and Buddhists. 6.6.4 Friends Missionary Prayer Band, 1958. FMBP came into existence at the right time when the committed indigenous missionaries were looking for an Indian mission agency. Young Tamil men started FMPB in 1958. FMPB is an indigenous and interdenominational organization which originated in the southern part of Tamil Nadu. It is basically a mission agency that sends missionaries to unreached areas, and it brought a great revival and awareness about missions in the Asian context. From 1966, Go or Send has been its motto, based on the Great Commission, MT 28:18-20, and Romans 10:14-15. It made a great impact on the country and it had grown rapidly. It had a total of 620 missionaries and 120 field stations in 17 states. 300 local evangelists, converts, were trained as leaders in about 1,600 congregations begun by the mission. One of the important features of FMPB ministry is to plant indigenous churches in its cross-cultural mission. The significant fact in this movement is that it has the concern and burden for the unreached people groups in North India, and most of its work is established in North India. FMPB was instrumental in bringing people movement in South Gujarat in 1977. Adivasi tribals in South Gujarat responded to the gospel and there were people movements. FMPB's major emphasis is evangelism in 3 phases: seed showing evangelism in a 10-kilometer area, concentration on responsive areas, church planting. This strategy worked very well in their mission field. There were many conversions in South Gujarat by the efforts of FMPB mission work. It had a great impact on the Surat, Narmada, and Bharuch districts of South Gujarat. In these districts, FMPB concentrated on Vaisava, Chowdhury, and Gamut Adivasi tribals, and it established 100 churches and 393 congregations, and 85 full-time evangelists. It also made a great impact in the districts of Dangs, Navsari, and Valsad. In these districts, FMPB made a significant impact on the tribals of Kuna, Hills, Mangada, and Worli, and there are 188 churches and 489 congregations, and 127 full-time evangelists. FMPB could make this great impact on South Gujarat because it practiced indigenous methods in its approach. The missionaries learned the local language and developed local leadership. The significant thing about FMPB is that it emphasizes simple living and servanthood. Its relationship with churches is quite significant, and it serves as a model for other organizations because it maintains healthy relationships with the mainline churches. This movement is completely indigenous in its leadership and finance. Giasing reports, most of FMPB's support is raised from Christians in Tamil Nadu. It applies contextual methods in mission and practices self-administration, self-support, and self-propagation. The critical assessment would help us to understand the in-depth and internal issues of the movement. Since the movement places much emphasis on cross-cultural evangelism, a good percentage of South Indian missionaries are dominant in the North Indian mission field. The movement is committed to raising indigenous native leaders, but when it comes to leadership positions, South Indians are dominant. The mission is moving from a sodality structure to a modality structure, which may kindle the vision and passion for missions. The caste stigma and ecclesiastical corruption silently prevail in the hierarchy of the mission. Even after several decades, the mission movement could not raise native leaders, and the leadership was not transferred to the indigenous leaders. The movement emerged with a vision to raise indigenous leaders, but it is functioning as a Western mission agency in a distant culture. Further research is needed to evaluate the movement in terms of its contribution to the Church's service to people in the local context. 4.6.5 Indian Evangelical Mission, 1965. Evangelical Fellowship of India was behind the formation of IEM. Theodore Williams is the founder of this mission movement. His initiation stimulated mission zeal among the executive committee members of EFI, and they gathered for a meeting on 15 January, 1965, at Devlali, Maharashtra. In this meeting, IEM was formed as an indigenous, interdenominational, and evangelical mission. Srinivasagam 2001, 368. In 1997, there were 430 missionaries and 15 overseas associate missionaries serving among 68 people groups at 87 mission stations. The significant fact about this movement is that about 95% of all financial support comes from within India, most of it rose by honorary area secretaries through prayer groups. They have a special training institute at Dharmapuri in Tamil Nadu in which they give special training for the missionaries to be adjusted in the mission field. The training includes courses such as linguistics, anthropology, evangelism, religions, village health care, bookkeeping, and other practical skills. IEM's main emphasis is on church planting among unreached people groups. It is one of the most powerful mission agencies of our time. IEM made a tremendous impact on Indian missions, and it stimulated mission fervor. One of the good things about this movement is that the Western ideology of church growth theory does not carry it out. Qualitative growth is given priority, and lay leadership is encouraged in its cross-cultural mission practice. The movement existed for the sake of a cross-cultural mission, and it has the strong ethos to raise indigenous leadership, but it needs to implement it. The movement initially functioned as a sodality-structured mission agency, but it is slowly moving towards modality structure. 4.6.6 India Mission Association, 1977. The rise of nationalism and independence prepared a way for Christian national leaders to take leadership in the church at large in India. After independence, Christian missionaries from the West found it very difficult to get visas. As a result, the national leaders had to take the leadership. In this scenario, in India prior to 1965, there were only 4 indigenous missions. From 1965, the newborn mission organizations and Indian Christians became conscious of cross-cultural evangelism. India Missions Association. Independent Indian missions just copied Western mission practice. In this context, the India Mission Association came into existence in 1977. The mission statement of IMA is: India Missions Association is the national federation of missions in India, which assists missions and churches in the proclamation of the good news and in making disciples of Jesus Christ among all peoples, languages, and geographical areas through members who partner to share resources, research, and training by their effective accountability and care of their personnel. India Missions Association. Its focus is to bring together Christian organizations in India for mutual help, cooperation, and corporate expression. Today, IMA represents 210 Indian mission organizations, agencies, and church groups and about 40,000 Christian workers within India and beyond. India Missions Association. IMA's contribution to Indian missions is significant. Ebenezer Sundar Raj comments, IMA not only provides coordination of the missionary work in India from its headquarters in Madras, but also brings together research centers, training centers, and mission resource groups in cooperative missionary efforts. IMA saw the need to strengthen missionary training in India. One of the significant contributions IMA made to the Indian Church was its initiation to form the Indian Institute of Missiology. 4.6.7 Indigenous Student Mission Movements. Several indigenous student movements made a significant contribution to campus ministry in the Indian university and college campuses. Some of these student movements have a Western connection in their origin, but they are purely indigenous in their mission theory and practice. The reason behind selecting the student movements is that student movements in the past have made a significant impact on world evangelization and have been behind the formation of mission agencies. It is true even in our Indian context. Therefore, UESI and ICPF are selected for the study. 4.6.7.1 Union of Evangelical Students of India, UESI. Professor Enoch was behind the formation of this UESI student movement. It is purely an indigenous movement in its leadership as well as for its resources. A group of college students used to meet in Enoch's residence at Poonamally High Road, Chennai, in the year 1949 for Bible study. A Manual for Evangelical Union informs, UESI was launched as a national movement on September 18, 1954. It started growing rapidly in every state, and in 1956, Chandapilla, a graduate of Columbia Bible College, became the first general secretary of the movement. Professor comments about him in his autobiography, he fitted in completely with our vision for the UESI with its indigenous distinctiveness and complete dependence on God for all our needs. Under the leadership of Chandapilla, UESI grew in the indigenous atmosphere in its policies and constitution. UESI is an interdenominational indigenous student movement and it does not form any churches. The members of the movement belong to different churches and denominations, working together with one goal to reach college students. It has been impacting the country in raising Indian leadership for the church and society because UESI seeks to evangelize the post-metric students in India, nurture them as disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ, that they may serve the church and society. Vision Statement 4. Its contribution to university students in India is quite significant. The UESI has also played a vital role in Indian missions, and its contribution to raising leadership within the Indian Church is significant. Quite a number of leaders and staff belonging to prominent mission agencies such as the Indian Evangelical Mission, IEM, Friends Missionary Prayer Band, FMPB, World Vision, InterServe India, and the Evangelical Fellowship of India Commission on Relief, EFACOR, have a UESI background. David Jayakumar found that the Indian Evangelical Mission had about 70 to 80% missionaries from UESI affiliates. One of the criticisms of this movement is that it has failed to relate to the existing church in India. Most of its members are churchless Christians, and those who are members of a local church are passive in their contribution to the church. This movement is also not free from the South Indian monopoly in North Indian missions. Almost all the key leadership positions are occupied by South Indian leaders. At times, the movement imposes a South Indian mission strategy in North India, which is not at all relevant to that culture and context. The movement is proud of its expansion in all the North and Northeastern states, but there is no single North Indian leader in their present executive committee. It shows its South Indian monopoly in North Indian missions. Those who migrate from south to north as tent makers are the active leaders in the movement, and they take over all the frontline leadership positions and ministry opportunities. The movement has 60 years of history in the country, but it failed to raise qualitative leaders from the north. Another interesting fact about this movement is that it overemphasizes quantitative growth and neglects qualitative growth in its recent appraisal. As a result, their staff is under pressure to produce the result and the dropout rate is increasing in the UESI staff team. The movement's contribution in reaching people of other faiths is not significant. The theory of contextualization is not seen in this movement because many traditional methods are deeply rooted in the movement. One of the reasons for the poor response from forward caste Hindus and Muslims is that UESI lacks contextual approaches to relate to them. Since the movement has evolved from the Western student movements, its methods are effective among the students with Christian background students. The traditional type of Bible study may not attract Orthodox Hindu students all the time. Caste is one of the major issues among the Hindus in India that may hinder them from responding to the gospel. In this context, McGavran's observation, people like to become Christians without crossing racial, linguistic, or class barriers, is noteworthy. UESI does not have any separate cells or fellowship groups based on social order, which may be one of the reasons that forward caste Hindu students are not responding much. There may be a reason from the movement's side to adopt such methods because UESI does not encourage such social and cultural distinctions based on caste and class. 4.6.7.2 Intercollegiate Prayer Fellowship, 1980. Intercollegiate Prayer Fellowship came into existence at a student convention in Karakanu, Kerala, in 1980. It expanded to 11 states of India with more than 80 indigenous full-time staff and it has about 500 cell groups in the Indian campuses. It is one of the fastest growing student movements in India because of its indigenous flavor. Actually, ICPF is a Bible-centered, indigenous, full gospel, non-denominational movement that looks to God to provide its needs. Contributions in kind from India and Indian brethren abroad support it. Its main focus is evangelism, and it has been targeting the young people in the college and school level for evangelizing and spreading the good news as these are the people who will be the future leaders. Even though it has 30 years of history, there is not much written information about this movement. It has branches in several North Indian states, but the North Indian leaders are not encouraged in the missions because the South Indian leadership mostly dominates it. Even though it is an indigenous movement, the ministry approach and methodologies are Western in their mission practice. Western music, a way of worship, and the influence of church growth theory can be seen in the movement. The movement is proud of its numerical growth, but its qualitative impact on young people is under question. Conclusion. The Indian Church has been growing in the recent past because of the indigenous missionary movements, which rely on indigenous expression of Christianity and mission methods. There are hundreds of indigenous mission agencies that are unspoken and unrecognized, but they are silently influencing the crowds of India. One of the observations from this study is that most of the indigenous missionary movements in India have been influenced by Western mission theories in one way or another. The Western influence is continuing in our Indian missions through their mission theories and strategies. The issue of caste has predominantly prevailed in Indian missions, which needs serious attention. The Church in India is growing numerically, but the qualitative growth needs to be focused on so that the Indian Church may transform the people of India. Chapter 5. As indigenous missions in India have taken deeper root, a vital question emerges: what kind of theology is guiding these missions? Chapter 5 shifts the focus from missionary structures and strategies to the internal logic that drives them: the theology, hermeneutics, and spiritual frameworks emerging from within the Indian context itself. Native missiology is not merely an academic discipline, it is a lived theology born out of Indian soil, shaped by local realities, and nurtured through contextual struggle. This chapter explores how Indian Christians have begun to articulate a mission theology that is distinctly theirs, biblically grounded, culturally resonant, and theologically self-aware. Native missiology seeks not to replicate Western theological models but to reimagine them in light of India's unique spiritual, social, and philosophical contexts. It draws upon the everyday experiences of Dalit believers, tribal communities, urban pastors, and village evangelists, those whose voices have too often been marginalized in mainstream theology. In doing so, it offers a theology of mission that is holistic, prophetic, and profoundly indigenous. This chapter introduces key thinkers, themes, and trajectories that define native missiology, and invites the reader to engage with a theology that does not speak about India from the outside, but speaks from India to the world. 5.1 Towards a Native Missiology. The story of Christian mission in India cannot be understood merely as a chapter in colonial religious history. It is a living narrative of resistance, reclamation, and resurgence. Yet, as India's indigenous missions transition from institutional maturity to theological responsibility, a deeper question arises: can indigenous missions in India develop a fully contextual missiology, one that speaks authentically to India's social, spiritual, and cultural realities? The term indigenous has historically referred to the transfer of leadership, funding, and governance to local hands, a model inspired by Henry Venn and Rufus Anderson's 3 self formula: self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating churches. While this model helped catalyze local agency in post-colonial contexts, it often failed to address the deeper issue of missiological imagination. Indian leaders may now run the mission agencies, but the theological frameworks, strategies, and measures of success are still frequently shaped by imported paradigms. A genuinely native missiology must go beyond these external features. It must be forged in the crucible of India's pluralism, caste realities, philosophical traditions, and post-colonial consciousness. Laman Suneh described this as translatability, not merely the translation of the gospel into local languages, but into the cultural logic and worldview of the people. A missiology rooted in India must begin not with what Western theology provides, but with what the Indian context demands. This is particularly urgent given the rise of Hindu majoritarian nationalism, legal restrictions on conversion, and social suspicion toward Christian activity. The mission field in India today is more contested than in previous decades. Strategies that once worked in tribal and rural areas are increasingly ineffective in urban, upper caste, or middle class settings. The prevailing narrative often casts Christianity as a foreign threat, reinforcing the need for a missiology that is undeniably Indian in voice and form. Such a missiology cannot be built in abstraction. It must emerge from the praxis of Indian Christians informed by their suffering, hospitality, poetry, village worship, and interfaith interactions. Andrew Walls has noted that the future of theology will be shaped not by seminaries in the West, but by the everyday faith of believers in the global South. In India, this means that the theological reflection of tribal evangelists, rural pastors, slum-dwelling believers, and student witnesses is not peripheral, it is central to the construction of a native theology of mission. This also requires a radical shift in theological education and mission training. The current model often privileges Western curricula, systematic theology in abstract categories, and borrowed evangelistic methods. Yet India's context calls for training in caste-sensitive discipleship, Dalit theology, Hindu philosophical engagement, and contextual apologetic. The work of M. Thomas and Stanley Samarthi in the ecumenical space laid some foundational thinking, but their legacy has not yet been fully developed into a practical, grassroots-oriented missiology. Moreover, a native missiology must rediscover the power of story and imagination. India's religious consciousness is shaped not only by doctrine but by epics, festivals, metaphors, and rituals. Indian Christian mission must learn to embody the gospel through indigenous art forms, bhajans, street theatre, narrative preaching, and symbols that resonate with the local psyche without compromising the centrality of Christ. Finally, the question of agency and authorship must be addressed. Too often, even within indigenous mission networks, the dominant theological texts, strategies, and conferences are shaped by voices outside the Indian context or by a narrow circle within it. If India is to bless the nations, as the Church here matures into a global mission-sending body, then its theology must not merely echo others, it must contribute anew. In this regard, the development of a native missiology is not an optional academic endeavor, it is a missional imperative. Without it, indigenous missions risk becoming structurally local but theologically foreign. With it, India's gospel witness can speak to the nation's soul not as an imported creed, but as truth embodied in Indian soil. 5.2 Indigenous Mission in a Shifting India. India is experiencing profound transformation on multiple fronts: political, social, technological, and ecological. While indigenous missions once thrived in the rural and tribal margins, they now find themselves in a rapidly shifting landscape where older models are becoming increasingly insufficient. Understanding this dynamic context is not just an academic exercise, it is a missiological necessity. The Church in India must recognize that mission today must adapt to new realities without surrendering its theological integrity. The political landscape and religious nationalism. One of the most defining features of India's recent decades has been the rise of Hindu nationalism. While India remains constitutionally secular, the socio-political influence of the Hindutva movement, particularly under the leadership of the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, has blurred the lines between religion and statecraft. The result has been a surge in legislation regulating religious conversion, particularly in northern states like Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat. These freedom of religion laws, ironically framed as protective measures, have frequently been used to harass pastors, detain evangelists, and suppress the growth of Christian communities, particularly those engaging in Dalit and tribal contexts. Chad Bauman observes that the function of these laws is often not legal adjudication but intimidation and delegitimization. Indigenous mission leaders now operate under surveillance, with increased risk of mob violence, social exclusion, or legal action. In response, many mission agencies have adopted a low-profile model, reducing overt evangelistic campaigns and shifting toward holistic development education, healthcare, and social work. While this can be theologically defensible, the danger is the drift toward a functionalist mission that abandons proclamation altogether. The challenge, then, is to develop a public theology that is bold yet wise, engaging politically hostile environments without provocation or retreat. Urbanization and the rise of a new middle-class audience. The India of today is no longer a primarily rural nation. By 2030, over 600 million Indians will live in urban areas, and the middle class is expanding rapidly. This demographic shift presents both a challenge and an opportunity for indigenous missions. Historically, mission agencies focused on rural, tribal, or impoverished communities. Theologically, this was rooted in the mission of Jesus to the poor and marginalized. However, urban India is spiritually and culturally different. It is shaped by modern aspirations, digital media, interfaith environments, and a desire for upward mobility. In cities like Mumbai, Delhi, and Bengaluru, the gospel is often met not with persecution but with indifference. Spirituality is personalized and privatized, and religious belief is viewed more as a lifestyle choice than a communal identity. Mission efforts must therefore shift from event-driven outreach to relational, incarnational models, presence-based ministry in residential societies, workspaces, and student campuses. Moreover, middle-class Indians are more likely to engage with questions of meaning, justice, science, and philosophy. Thus, apologetic, cultural engagement, and theological depth are essential. Urban missions cannot afford theological shallowness. They must equip believers to defend the faith and live it winsomely in secular, pluralistic contexts. Migration, diaspora, and translocal networks. Another crucial development is India's vast internal and international migration. Domestically, rural Indians migrate to urban centers in search of work, creating new church networks among domestic migrants, often unregistered and fragile. At the same time, the Indian diaspora has grown to over 32 million globally, with strong communities in the Gulf states, North America, Europe, and Australia. These translocal flows create missionary bridges where Indian believers, once evangelized in North Indian villages, become lay pastors in Dubai or Doha, where Telugu-speaking congregations in Toronto remain connected to Andhra-based mission networks. Indigenous missions must begin to see diaspora ministry not as external to their calling, but as an extension of their missional identity. This also means that theological training and pastoral formation must take into account cross-cultural skills, legal pluralism, and global ecclesiology. The future of Indian missions may be as much about sending from Mumbai to Muscat as it is from Chennai to Chhattisgarh. Digitization and the new mission frontier. India is now one of the largest internet markets in the world, with over 850 million active users and growing smartphone penetration across rural and urban areas. This digital explosion has reshaped how Indians engage with religion, community, and authority. YouTube pastors, WhatsApp Bible groups, and Instagram devotional content now coexist with traditional church gatherings. Digital media is not merely a tool, it is a cultural ecosystem. Missions must think not only about how to use media, but how media reshapes spiritual formation, theology, and community. While digital outreach allows broad access and anonymity important in hostile contexts, it also raises concerns about doctrinal accountability, relational discipleship, and spiritual depth. To adapt, Indigenous missions must develop digital native leadership, train content creators, and invest in vernacular media, short films, testimonies, podcasts, and live stream worship, all grounded in rich theological and pastoral care. The online space is not a supplement to mission, it is a primary field of witness. Education, secularism, and the intellectual frontier. Indian society has increasingly embraced secularism in its civic and educational spaces, though this secularism is distinct from its Western counterpart. In India, secularism often implies religious pluralism rather than irreligion. However, in elite educational institutions, Christianity is often misunderstood as a Western imposition, and evangelistic language is viewed with suspicion or hostility. Thus, there is an urgent need for contextual apologetic, the ability to explain and commend the Christian faith within the Indian intellectual tradition. This involves engaging with Vedanta, Buddhism, modern philosophy, science, and ethics from a Christian worldview. The legacy of figures like Brahmabandhu Upadhyay and A.J. Appasamy offers models for this kind of dialogue. Indigenous missions must cultivate Christian scholars, writers, lawyers, and educators who embody the gospel in public thought. This is not mission by proclamation alone, but by participation, living as salt and light within India's academic and cultural institutions. Environmental crisis and ecological theology. India is facing multiple ecological crises: deforestation, groundwater depletion, pollution, and climate-related disasters. These disproportionately affect the poor, especially tribal communities who live close to the land. Christian mission cannot be silent on these issues. A native missiology must include a theology of creation care, land justice, and sustainability. This is particularly appropriate for indigenous missions, which already work among agrarian and tribal populations. The biblical witness, particularly in Psalms, the Prophets, and Romans 8, calls for a mission that reconciles not only humanity to God, but all creation. Missional praxis could include reforestation programs, clean water initiatives, theological education on environmental ethics, and liturgies that celebrate creation. Such practices embody the gospel not only in word but in solidarity with the earth and the vulnerable. Facing the context with missional maturity. In all these shifting currents, political, urban, migratory, digital, intellectual, and ecological, indigenous missions in India face both risk and opportunity. The movement must now transition from reactive strategies to responsive wisdom, from inherited templates to contextual discernment. India is not the same country it was in 1970 or even 2000. The mission field has changed and the missiology must follow. But change does not mean compromise. A contextual mission is not a diluted mission. It is the incarnational logic of the gospel, expressed anew for every generation and setting. To be faithful to India today, indigenous mission must be theologically rich, socially engaged, digitally present, and prophetically courageous. 5.3 Rethinking Outcomes. Christian mission in India has historically prioritized conversion as its primary metric of success. While numerical growth remains important, abundant academic critique argues that transformation, both personal and communal, is the truest sign of gospel efficacy in post-colonial contexts. Conversion without sustainable transformation creates fragile faith communities and often provokes critique of missionary short-termism. Defining transformation in missiological terms. The concept of integral mission, rooted in Latin American theological reflection, emphasizes that evangelism and social responsibility are inseparable. This missiological approach argues that transformation occurs when proclamation and demonstration coexist in mission praxis, reflecting the biblical imperative to love God and neighbor alike. Within Indian contexts, Vinay Kumar Samuel, a pioneering Indian theologian, has been instrumental in articulating such an approach, emphasizing holistic transformation that addresses spiritual, social, and economic dimensions concurrently. Transformation, unlike conversion, implies enduring change in individual and community life, spiritual maturity, socio-economic uplift, human dignity, and public witness. It signifies the gospel taking root in lifestyle, justice structures, and local agency. Conversion-centered models, legacy and limitations. Traditional mission models in India have often aligned with revivalist or evangelistic campaigns featuring tent meetings, mass outreach, and charismatic calls to faith. Their success has been measured in baptism numbers and new congregations, yet results often lacked follow-up structures for discipleship, leadership training, or community empowerment. This has led to nominal conversions, where new believers may revert under pressure or remain disconnected from church life. While sincere in intent, many mission programs did not account for caste-based systemic barriers, gender inequality, or holistic education. Consequently, conversion sometimes created dependency on external funding and leadership, without cultivating local sustainability or theological formation. Indigenous mission leaders increasingly recognize that transformation must be the deeper goal, not the incidental byproduct of church planting. Holistic mission practices in India. A number of indigenous mission movements have embraced integral mission principles to greater effect. In urban slums, several mission networks integrate literacy programs, vocational training, microfinance, and conflict resolution alongside evangelism. These projects aim for community transformation through empowerment rather than charity. In Northeast India, tribal churches emphasize self-governance and local theological reflection, resisting dependency, and cultivating contextual leadership and worship forms. Dalit Christian movements have foregrounded justice-oriented discipleship, addressing land rights, caste stigma, education access, and collective dignity. These approaches embody the belief that conversion is not complete without transformation socially, spiritually, and culturally. Theological foundations for integral transformation. Integral mission draws its theological strength from the holistic ministry of Jesus as portrayed in Luke 4:18-19, where proclamation and healing are inseparable. The Lausanne Covenant, 1974, later articulated this by affirming that evangelism and social concern are part and parcel of Christian duty. Moreover, the theological work of Vinay Samuel and Chris Sugden advocates mission as transformation not simply in souls, but in social structures, individual integrity, and communal flourishing. In the Indian theological tradition, thinkers like M. H. Horton, P. Chenchia, and Brahmabandhavupadhyay underscored that Christ's salvation engaged all dimensions of life, not merely ritual or doctrine, but moral, social, and spiritual renewal. While these voices predated contemporary integral mission discourse, their commitments reflect similar convictions that faith must meet life in its totality. Challenges and opportunities. Implementing transformation-oriented mission faces several hurdles. Resource constraints. Financial or training limitations can skew focus toward evangelism at the expense of sustained discipleship or community development. Measurement difficulty. Transformation is qualitative, contextual, and long-term. Metrics are harder to define than conversion counts. Contextual distrust. In caste-sensitive areas, development interventions may be viewed as conversion tools, leading to legal or social backlash. Theological impatience. Evangelistic zeal sometimes undervalues the slower work of cultural change, reconciliation, and community building. Emerging urban mission collectives partner with NGOs or local civic groups in slum rehabilitation, youth mentoring, and women's empowerment, fostering trust and transformation simultaneously. Digital platforms now host long-term discipleship models, including video teaching series, small group platforms, and mentoring networks that encourage spiritual depth and community care. Grassroots theologians among Dalit and tribal groups are articulating locally rooted theologies of redemption, liberation, and reconciliation, sparking revitalized missional engagement from within. Transformation as the future missional metric. Shifting from conversion-centered to transformation-oriented mission is not merely about semantics. It requires structural changes such as integrating leadership development, community organizing, theological formation, and justice advocacy into mission plans. It also requires patience, long-term commitment, and local theological authority. In Indian Indigenous Mission, this shift aligns with the goal of self-theologizing, self-propagating, and self-sustaining churches. It resists the temptation to import Western definitions of success and embraces indigenous metrics: flourishing communities, peace building, literacy, dignity restored, local leadership, and spiritual maturity. As the following sections explore the unengaged frontiers and strategic imperatives, keep in view this foundational insight: conversion is the doorway, transformation is the destination. 5.4 Unengaged frontiers. Urban, forward caste, Muslim, and Buddhist communities. While indigenous missions in India have carried the gospel to marginalized Dalit and tribal communities with increasing reach and intensity, certain segments of society remain largely unengaged: upper caste Hindus, affluent urban classes, educated elites, Muslims, and Buddhists. Engaging these groups necessitates reimaging strategies and missiological frameworks rooted in contextual intelligence and theological sensitivity. The upper caste and elite urban spectrum. Despite decades of mission activity, upper caste Hindus, particularly Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas residing in urban centers, remain minimally penetrated by indigenous mission efforts. The enduring social structures of caste and privilege create both a barrier of prejudice and an expectation of respectability that Christian witness must account for. The Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen has noted that caste continues to form identity boundaries that shape social interaction and innovation even in cosmopolitan settings. Early missionaries such as those in the St. Thomas tradition attempted to reach upper castes through education and cultural respect, yet these strategies often reinforced colonial elitism rather than contextual engagement. More recent mission efforts default to engaging the poor, bypassing the powerful. Theologically, this reflects a heartfelt concern for the poor, but misses the biblical imperative to reach every socio-economic layer. Nonviolent engagement with Hindu elites. To engage upper caste Hindus meaningfully, mission must navigate respect for religious identity without compromising gospel distinctiveness. Arvind Sharma observes that Hindu reform movements such as Arya Samaj and Satyashodak Samaj have themselves blended critique of caste with reconstructions of spiritual identity. Christian mission must learn from this situated critique, to engage with caste identity honestly, while offering a transcendent vision of dignity in Christ that does not demean cultural belonging. This demands incarnational theology, a gospel shaped by Indian symbols, stories, and metaphors that speak to privilege and power. Rather than confront Hinduism head-on, such engagement might begin with shared concerns: truth, justice, meaning, and move into deeper dialogue over time. Reaching Muslim and Buddhist communities. Muslims and Buddhists constitute significant spiritual communities in India, yet indigenous missions have historically lacked sustained engagement with them. While colonial-era missions often targeted Buddhist relic worship or Islamic doctrine polemically, contemporary missiology must adopt a posture of sensitive witness and relational dialogue. Strategic engagement with Muslim communities is complicated by legal and social restrictions, but the growth of mission-aware Muslims, especially among educated youth, creates arena for honest conversation. Similarly, engagement with Buddhists, particularly in the context of Dalit conversion or Burmese Buddhist refugees, demands respect for non-theistic frameworks and a gospel articulated through compassion, witness, and communal love rather than theological confrontation. The urban middle-class frontier. Urban India, represented by a burgeoning middle class, is perhaps the most complex frontier. These individuals are connected, ambitious, and often hold spiritual beliefs but are wary of religious identity altogether. As Vishal Mangalwadi has argued, such societies value transformation through ideas, not rituals. Christian witness among them must therefore focus on public theology, intellectual engagement, justice initiatives, and exemplifying credible character. Urban mission does not thrive through mass campaigns, rather, it flourishes through smaller communities, mentorship networks, workplace presence, and artistic expression. The gospel must come through stories of relevance, creative witness, and personal integrity to overcome distrust and indifference. Overcoming internal blind spots. Even within indigenous mission agencies, upper caste communities are often ignored, not purely due to survival pragmatism, but due to historical prejudice and structural inertia. Christianity's social base remains heavily Dalit and tribal, 70%-90%, reinforcing stigma that the church is only for the oppressed. Without intentional strategic focus on upper caste communities, mission risks remaining sociologically confined. This blind spot reflects deeper theological assumptions about God's preferred targets. Yet biblical narrative reveals God's heart for every tribe and language and people and nation. To fulfill this biblical mandate, indigenous missions must recalibrate priorities, resources, and vision to include the unengaged frontiers with humility and fidelity. Missional pathways forward. Engaging these neglected frontiers requires more than goodwill, it requires missional imagination and structural innovation. Develop educational institutions, especially in elite urban zones, that integrate intellectual rigor, Christian worldview, and cultural sensitivity. Encourage Indian Christian artists, musicians, and writers to interpret gospel themes through Indian aesthetic idioms, poetry, classical arts, digital storytelling. Train mission leaders in contextual dialogue, philosophy, apologetic, and nonviolent engagement so conversations with Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists can be sustained and respectful. While still nascent, some pioneering urban fellowships, campus movements, and thought leadership institutes are demonstrating what such engagement might look like: quietly influential, relationally rooted, and intellectually credible. Conclusion: honoring silence with strategy. India's unengaged frontiers are not passive, they are often assertive in their religious traditions and cultural sensibilities. Indigenous missions must cease treating these groups as backdrops for devotion or witness. Instead, they must be strategic mission fields demanding theological sophistication and incarnational humility. This section does not prescribe quick fixes, but calls for a long-term vision, that the gospel should not only flow downward into the margins, but upward into the seats of influence and identity. Only then can Indian mission claim completeness, not merely as a movement of the oppressed, but as a comprehensive witness to every part of India's complex spiritual tapestry. Women and youth in Indigenous missions, voices long silenced. In the tapestry of Indigenous mission in India, two groups, women and youth, have often provided essential energy, innovation, and resilience, yet remain underrepresented in leadership, theological formation, and strategic decision-making. Their increasing prominence represents a transformative opportunity for Native mission. 5.5 Historical contributions of women in mission. Already in the colonial era, Indian women played pivotal roles in mission-led education and healthcare initiatives. The Zenana mission effort, women missionaries and Indian Bible women made possible outreach to secluded women in Purta, combining teaching, healthcare, and gospel witness in culturally sensitive ways. These women often operated without institutional recognition but made substantial inroads into homes and hearts. Post-colonial mission movements in India inherited this legacy but did not systematically empower Indian women as agents of mission leadership. Women and youth in Indigenous missions, voices long silenced. Women and youth have long been the heartbeat of Christian mission in India, yet their leadership, theological reflection, and structural empowerment often remain peripheral. A truly native missiology must recover and center these neglected voices as sources of theological vision and cultural engagement. Historical foundations, Pandita Ramabai and the Muddy Mission. Pandita Ramabai remains one of the most respected indigenous Christian women pioneers in India. Born into a Marathi Brahmin family, 1858, she received Sanskrit education and public acclaim before personal tragedy drove her to reform India's treatment of widows. After her conversion in England in 1883, Ramabai founded Sharada Sadan in Bombay, later relocating to Yeon as Muddy Mission, providing refuge, education, vocational training, and spiritual nurture to high-caste child widows and destitute women. Her evangelical conviction shaped Muddy into both a social reform movement and a Christian community, emphasizing dignity, autonomy, and spiritual renewal. Ramabai's translation of the Bible into colloquial Marathi was driven by a desire to reach lower caste women marginalized by existing translations. Her leadership style was also notably independent, refusing doctrinal co-option by Anglicans or Hindu reform circles. She insisted that Christian faith should not alienate Indian cultural identity but affirm dignity in Christ. Her legacy continues through Muddy Mission's ongoing work and her contributions to feminist theology in India. Indian women's contributions to mission, health and education. Indian women played vital yet often overlooked roles in mission institutions, especially in healthcare and education. Mary Schaller-Blaufuss's research on the Christian Medical College in Vellore demonstrates the critical contributions of Indian women in local evangelism and healthcare outreach. These Bible women and Indian staff negotiated cross-cultural boundaries, extended healing ministries to secluded women, and shaped mission theory in Women's Work for Women, spanning education, medical care, and gospel proclamation. This narrative underscores that Indian women were not passive recipients but agents of mission praxis, integrating service and witness in culturally sensitive ways that predated formal feminist theology in the country. Women's theological leadership, Sub-Amma and emerging voices. Theologians such as B.V. Sub-Amma broke theological and ecclesial ground in the 20th century. Ordained in 1999 as one of the first Indian women pastors, Sub-Amma founded Christian ashrams, pursued theological training in India and the West, and emphasized incarnational Christian faith rooted in local spirituality. Her writings critique colonial frameworks and advocate for a genuinely indigenous Christian witness shaped by Indian philosophical categories, women's voices, and spiritual disciplines rooted in Indian ashram traditions. Sub-Amma's example challenges indigenous missions to elevate theological leadership not by tokenism but through structural equity, that mission theologizing must include, not merely tolerate, scholarly women voices from diverse castes and regions. Youth participation, emerging missional catalysts. While the academic literature on Indian youth in indigenous mission is still emerging, demographic and missiological trends point to youth as indispensable contributors to mission's future. Recent sociological data show India's under-25 population remains among the world's largest, with rapid uptake of digital media indicating potential for peer-led evangelism, social innovation, and theological creativity. Anecdotal reports from campus fellowships and digital ministry movements highlight youth pioneering devotional podcasts, peer discipleship networks, and culturally resonant missional art. Though formal documentation is limited, these trends imply a generation keen to embody mission differently from previous eras. Intersectional barriers, caste, gender, and age. Indian women and young people, particularly from Dalit and tribal communities, face layered marginalization within churches and mission agencies. Social stigma, restricted access to theological education, and limited leadership opportunity converge to silence their perspectives. The failure to include these intersectional voices impoverishes missiological vision and sustains hierarchical structures antithetical to gospel dignity. Redressing these gaps is not optional, it is necessary if indigenous mission aims to reflect the full community of Christ in India's diversity. Toward inclusion, leadership formation, and theological agency. Empowering women and youth in Indian mission requires more than inclusion, it requires agency. Mission agencies and theological institutions should offer scholarships for marginalized women and youth, fellowship networks that support theological writing and teaching, and platforms for trauma-informed pastoral ministry rooted in Indian women's experiences. Leadership pipelines must intentionally learn from Subbama's and Ramabai's models, visionary women who shaped mission not from margin but from the center. Similarly, youth-oriented mission training must equip digital storytelling, peer mentorship, and contextual apologetics suited to young Hindu, Muslim, and skeptical audiences. Youth need not mirror older paradigms but bring fresh articulations of faith rooted in their own cultural grammars. Conclusion: reimagining missiology through marginalized voices. When women and youth, especially from historically marginalized backgrounds, are integrated not as beneficiaries but as co-authors of mission theology and praxis, Indian missions move toward theological maturity. A native missiology shaped by these voices is not diluted, it becomes richer, more contextual, and more trustworthy. Recovering Ramabai's vision, honoring Subbama's theology, and empowering the digital youth, indigenous missions can begin to speak not only for the poor and tribal but from them. This prophetic integration is essential for missional credibility in the 21st century Indian Church. 5.6 The global role of Indian indigenous missions. The story of Indian Christianity has long been framed in terms of Western missionary input, with Indian believers cast as recipients of theological tradition and ecclesial structure. However, in the 21st century, a striking reversal is underway. Indian indigenous missions, particularly those emerging from non-Western theological contexts, tribal and Dalit leadership, and regional church networks, are becoming active participants in the global missionary movement. This phenomenon challenges long-held assumptions about theological authority, missionary identity, and ecclesial leadership in world Christianity. From mission field to mission force. India, once considered a mission field by Western agencies, has now become a mission-sending nation. Indian evangelists, pastors, and missionaries are now serving in Southeast Asia, the Gulf countries, East Africa, and even in Western countries such as the UK and Canada. Historian Dana Robert has referred to this shift as a hallmark of the polycentric nature of contemporary world Christianity, in which the Global South emerges as a missionary engine. Indian missions are at the forefront of this development. One of the unique features of Indian missionary expansion is its rootedness in poverty and suffering. Many Indian missionaries serve bivocationally, often without the institutional security or international fundraising support that sustains Western counterparts. The resilience of these indigenous leaders demonstrates that mission can flourish from below, shaped not by wealth or power, but by spiritual fervor and sacrificial commitment. Diaspora missions and reverse flows. A significant dimension of India's global mission is through its vast diaspora community, now numbering over 30 million globally. Indian Christian migrants in the Gulf states, North America, Australia, and Europe have begun planting churches, initiating campus ministries, and offering leadership in multicultural congregations. These reverse mission flows complicate the narrative of unidirectional evangelism and suggest that migration can become a theological resource for mission. Sociologist Jacob Thomas observes that many Indian diaspora Christians, particularly from Kerala's Marthoma and Pentecostal communities, have taken on leadership roles in previously Western-dominated spaces. Their presence is not limited to language-based ethnic churches but increasingly shapes multi-ethnic and transnational ecclesial identities. Indigenous Indian theology, developed in the crucible of marginalization and contextual struggle, is now informing global conversations on spirituality, justice, and contextual hermeneutics. Contextual theology as global contribution. Indian theological contributions, especially from Dalit, tribal, and feminist theologians, are gaining recognition for offering alternative epistemologies of suffering, liberation, and identity. Arvind P. Nirmal's Dalit theology and V. Devasahayam's theology of struggle articulate gospel hope through the lived realities of oppression, not abstract speculation. These theological voices are being received as vital correctives to Eurocentric paradigms, emphasizing relationality, suffering, and communal dignity. Rather than merely echoing global evangelical frameworks, Indian theologians are contributing new categories and narratives like Loke Samgraha, the welfare of all, Satya, truth, and Moksha, liberation, reframed in Christian theological terms. This shift signals that global theology is no longer Western export but a polyphonic dialogue of diverse Christian imaginaries, with Indian voices gaining recognition as equal partners. Challenges in internationalizing Indian missions. Despite growing influence, Indian indigenous missions face considerable obstacles in global engagement. Linguistic limitations, visa restrictions, racial and caste prejudices, and lack of funding infrastructure often hinder participation. Moreover, some Indian mission models, deeply contextualized for caste-based or tribal communities, require translation and adaptation when applied outside the subcontinent. There is also the theological challenge of avoiding triumphalism. The global expansion of Indian missions must be self-reflective, conscious of the risks of replicating colonial or caste hierarchical models under a different flag. Missional success must not come at the cost of humility or contextual sensitivity. 6.5 The Global Church and Indian Ecclesiology. What India offers to the global church is not only numerical growth or spiritual vitality, but a distinctive ecclesiology of resilience, community, and hospitality. House churches among persecuted communities, women-led prayer fellowships, and multi-caste congregations provide models of inclusive, embodied Christianity. These expressions challenge Western forms of individualistic, professionalized ecclesiology and offer insights into survival theology and public witness in hostile settings. The Indian Church has also demonstrated remarkable ecumenical cooperation in practical mission across denominational lines, charismatic and liturgical streams, and caste divisions. This capacity for pragmatic unity in mission is a gift to a fragmented global church. 6.6 Toward a mutual exchange of gifts. The future of Indian indigenous missions in the global church lies not in imitation, but in mutual exchange. Indian leaders bring narrative-rich theology, spiritual perseverance, and contextual insight. In turn, partnerships with churches in Africa, Latin America, and the West can offer resources, theological critique, and cross-cultural accountability. As Leslie Newbigin envisioned, mission must be understood as from everywhere to everywhere, not from rich to poor or west to east. In this vision, Indian missions are not merely catching up, they are redefining the terms of global Christianity. Theologians, church planters, and disciples formed in Andhra, Manipur, or Jharkhand are helping to shape the faith in Toronto, Nairobi, or Kuala Lumpur. The mission impulse is no longer from center to periphery but between margins, from one context of struggle and grace to another. 5.7 Toward a theology of hope in a post-colonial India. Post-colonial India presents indigenous missions with a complex mixture of freedom and fear, openness and opposition, revival and resistance. The legacy of colonialism, caste hierarchies, communal politics, and poverty continues to cast a long shadow over how Christianity is received and practiced. Yet it is precisely in such a wounded context that a robust theology of hope must be articulated, one that neither romanticizes suffering nor surrenders to despair. Hope in the Indian Christian context must begin with an honest reckoning with pain. From Dalit Christians denied burial in upper caste cemeteries to tribal believers displaced by mining projects. The reality of suffering is not abstract but deeply embodied. A theology of hope cannot bypass these wounds. Instead, it must become a voice of lament and resilience, standing in solidarity with the marginalized while announcing the promise of new creation. This theology must also reclaim India's indigenous spiritual imagination. Indian philosophical traditions have long wrestled with concepts of destiny, karma, liberation, moksha, and divine presence, Satchitananda. A contextual theology of hope will not reject these outright but seek conversation and reinterpretation. Jesus Christ, in this setting, must be seen not as a Western savior imposed from outside, but as the liberator from within the story of Indian suffering, the one who enters caste exclusion, who walks with the poor, who embodies both sacrifice and vindication. Missiologically, hope must be relational. It is not simply a doctrine but a social force building communities of reconciliation, empowering trauma healing, resisting systemic injustice, and creating models of flourishing that reflect the kingdom of God. In many slums, villages, and conflict zones, such hope is already being lived out through prayer fellowships, indigenous worship forms, grassroots discipleship circles, and acts of quiet resistance. These expressions are not programmatic, they are incarnational. This hopeful vision also reframes the future of Indian missions. Rather than fixating on rapid church growth or numerical metrics, it calls the Church to invest in long-term presence, theological education from below, and interfaith peace-building. It reminds Indian Christians that they are not victims of history, but agents of God's renewal. They bear a hope that is both contextual and cosmic, rooted in local struggle and reaching toward eschatological glory. Ultimately, a theology of hope in post-colonial India affirms that resurrection does not erase the cross, it transfigures it. Indian indigenous mission, if shaped by this theology, will not run from pain but testify through it, proclaiming that even in the dust of caste, violence, and displacement, new life is still being born. 5.8 Epilogue, From Roots to Rivers. A benediction for India's indigenous mission. India's indigenous mission stands at a historic threshold, looking back on a century of faithful struggle, and forward into an era of greater complexity and greater promise. What began in colonial margins through Bible women, village pastors, tribal evangelists, and suffering saints has now grown into a diverse, indigenous movement capable of shaping theology, engaging the nation, and participating in global Christianity. Yet this future does not lie in becoming more Western, more efficient, or more powerful. It lies in becoming more deeply rooted in India's soil, suffering, songs, and scriptures. Like the banyan tree, the indigenous mission must send its roots deeper, drawing nourishment from cultural memory and spiritual resilience, until its branches stretch out to offer shade, healing, and witness to the nations. This is not a call to triumph, but to faithfulness. The call is not to conquest, but to community. In a time of political polarization, religious nationalism, digital fragmentation, and social inequality, the Indian Church must continue to walk the road of the cross, weak but true, poor but rich in faith, scattered but gathered in Christ. Its mission is not to mimic others but to sing its own doxology in its own voice. A new generation is watching. Women theologians are writing liturgies of liberation. Youth leaders are planting digital discipleship networks. Dalit pastors are preaching resurrection under the gaze of caste violence. Tribal believers are praying in forests threatened by development. Their voices do not shout, but they echo with the thunder of hope. The Spirit moves not only in institutions but in whispers, in tears, in testimony, in the faithful holding of tension. Let this final word be a blessing. May the God of the margins walk with India's mission in the center and the periphery. May the Christ of the wounded hands guide each path of healing. May the Spirit of wisdom empower local vision, prophetic song, and humble strength. And may the Indian Church torn yet anointed become a river of grace in a dry land. This is not the end, but ascending. May the native missiology yet to be written be born in prayer, in suffering, and in joy. Let India's mission not only survive. Let it flourish.